Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. I'm Robert, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they are essential to help the channel grow and allow me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The sun hung like a molten gold coin in the vast cerulean sky above Malta D. It was July 2016, and the Mediterranean air pulsed with feverish energy. The atmosphere was thick with salt, sun-scorched rock, and the sweet perfume of oleander. Tourists flocked to the island's shores like migratory birds, drawn by promises of crystalline waters, labyrinthine golden cities, and nights that throbbed with music and life. Among them was Mike Mann's Halt, a young man standing on the edge of his 18th birthday. His spirit blazed as bright and boundless as the summer sky above. He wasn't just another tourist. He was an adventurer. At 17, Mike carried a soul seasoned by travels that many twice his age only dreamed of. Born and raised in the green, orderly landscapes of Oldenburg, Germany, his heart belonged to the wild, untamed corners of the world. He was a son of the sea and mountains. His life was a tapestry woven with thrilling escapades. With his family, he'd navigated the tempestuous waters around the Shetland Islands and crossed the vast, unforgiving expanse of the North Atlantic to Iceland's volcanic shores. A year before, he and his father Baron had paddled a canoe down the Yukon River in Canada. Their hands sifted through cold, clear water, searching for gold in Dawson City. Mike was a doer, a chaser of horizons. His father, a goldsmith by trade, saw in his son not just a reflection of his own love for craftsmanship and detail, but a spirit forged of something rarer, more precious. Pure, unadulterated courage. This trip to Malta was different. It was a rite of passage, his first solo holiday, a declaration of his burgeoning independence. He arrived on July 8th, 2016, a solitary figure with a backpack and a heart full of anticipation. He checked into a modest hotel in Slima, a bustling town where modern life jostled with old-world charm, its waterfront a glittering promenade of cafes and shops. For a time, he wasn't entirely alone. His girlfriend joined him, sharing those initial days of exploration and discovery before her own departure. Then Malta was his alone to conquer. He rented a mountain bike, a sturdy machine that would become his companion across the island's rugged terrain. Clipped to his person was his ever-present eye, a silver GoPro Hero 2 camera. For a boy who lived his life as a series of action sequences, leaping from cliffs into turquoise coves, climbing rock faces, exploring hidden paths, documenting the experience was part of the adventure itself. The camera was an extension of his memory, capturing the world as he saw it. A grand, exhilarating spectacle. On July 18th, 8 days before his body would be discovered, Mike sent a voice message to his father. His voice carried across the ether from the sun-drenched island to the familiar quiet of their German home, filled with breathless exhilaration of a challenge met and enjoyed. He spoke of cycling in Malta, the demanding hills, the heat, the sheer physical joy of pushing his limits. It was the last time Baron would ever hear his son's voice. The message was a snapshot of a life being lived to its fullest, a final vibrant echo before an encroaching, inexplicable silence. The days that followed were marked by a series of small, discordant notes that slowly built into a symphony of dread. The mountain bike wasn't returned to the rental shop the next day as scheduled. On July 22nd, the day Mike was due to land at Bremen Airport, his seat on the plane remained empty. In Oldenburg, the silence from Malta grew heavy, oppressive. The casual rhythm of a family waiting for their son's return from adventure fractured, then shattered. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. The boy who had crossed the Atlantic, who had navigated wild rivers and sailed through storms, had simply vanished on a small Mediterranean island. The man's whole family's world tilted on its axis. Baron and his wife Suzanne flew to Malta, their minds a frantic storm of questions and fear. They were no longer the parents of an adventurer. They were the parents of a missing person. At a Maltese police station, Suzanne, her face etched with a mother's primal terror, handed over photographs of her son, his bank account details, and the number for his black Samsung Galaxy Note phone. That same night, as his wife relayed the cold, hard facts of their son's identity to impassive officers, Baron packed a bag. As the sun rose, his flight took off from Germany. He was a man on a mission, fueled by a father's desperate instinct. He had to find his son. Even during a layover in Frankfurt, Baron was relentless, speaking to airport police who relayed the information to Germany's Federal Criminal Police Office, the BKA. The case was assigned to a specialized unit known as Serene, a team of investigators with access to a Europe-wide network of names, biometric data, and fingerprints. An experienced BKA investigator would later state that a case like Mike's would be given the highest priority. Half of Europe, it seemed, was now hunting for Mike's whereabouts. But on the ground in Malta, the search felt agonizingly slow. A desperate crawl against time. Baron threw himself into the effort, transforming from a worried father into a makeshift detective. He befriended a local man who claimed to be an informant, and together they drove across the island, plastering telephone poles and shop windows with photos of Mike. One showed him smiling broadly under a sun hat. The father's days blurred into a sleepless, sun-scorched haze. "I've been turning stones until the early morning," he wrote in his journal. A chronicle of heartbreak, one stone and one dead end at a time. False leads emerged like cruel mirages in the desert of their hope. A report placed Mike in a notorious drug-riddled establishment called the Tiger Bar, but no witnesses could confirm the sighting. Each rumor flickered with possibility, then quickly died out, leaving the darkness even more profound. Where was Mike? What had happened to the boy who loved the sea and the sky? Then, on July 26th, the message arrived. An anonymous tip had led police to the island's western coast. A body had been found. Baron arrived at Dingley Cliffs to the surreal sight of television camera crews already assembled, their lenses hungry for the tragedy unfolding. The cliffs are Malta's highest point, a dramatic 250-meter-high escarpment of rock that plunges into the deep blue Mediterranean. It's a place of stark, windswept beauty, a dusty plateau dotted with orange trees, the skeletal remains of an old radar facility, and the solitary, silent Magdalena Chapel. It's a place where one feels poised on the very edge of the world. Search dogs were working the area. A police officer approached Baron, his words a sterile command against the rising tide of paternal panic. "Wait here. Let the dog handlers do their work," he was told. Standing near the abyss, the father's desperation began to curdle into suspicion. There was a sense, nagging and insidious, that they wanted him out of the way, a spectator to his own life's most horrific scene. The discovery itself was a tableau of disturbing contradictions. Mike's body was found in a rock depression approximately 10 stories below the cliff's edge. He had been gone, a later autopsy would estimate, for about 7 to 8 days, placing his passing near the day he sent his final cheerful message. His rented bicycle wasn't shattered at the base of the cliff, but hung bizarrely in a bush a few feet above his body. His sports shoes and sunglasses were found a little farther down. But the boy, who had supposedly fallen from a height equivalent to a 25-story building, had no broken bones. None. Not. The damage to the bicycle was found to be inconsistent with such a catastrophic fall. These were the first of many details that simply didn't fit. Baron, his mind reeling, seized on other incongruities. He noticed hay scattered near the place where his son's body lay. It seemed oddly fresh, he thought, for a body that had been exposed to the brutal Maltese sun for over a week. He later questioned the farmer who owned the adjacent land, but the man offered no useful answers. The trail, like so many others, ran cold. The Maltese authorities moved forward with their own narrative. A magisterial inquiry was opened. An autopsy was performed at Mater Dei Hospital. The official conclusion was swift and simple. Mike, the 17-year-old adventurer, had passed from natural causes. The police considered the case closed. It was a tragic accident, a fall. A young tourist, perhaps unfamiliar with the terrain, had misjudged the path with fatal consequences. It was a neat, tidy explanation that sealed the case file and allowed the island's machinery of sun and tourism to grind on, undisturbed. For the family, however, the nightmare was only just beginning. The return of their son's body to Germany a month later was not an act of closure, but the opening of a new, more grotesque chapter of their ordeal. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit environment of the Medical University of Hanover, a second autopsy was scheduled, a desperate attempt to find answers that Malta had failed to provide. What the German pathologists discovered sent a shockwave of horror through the grieving family and blew the Maltese accident theory to pieces. Mike's body had been returned, but it was not whole. It was a hollowed-out shell. His heart was gone. His brain was gone. His neck organs, lungs, liver, pancreas, adrenal glands, right kidney, bladder, stomach, and small intestine were all missing. The only organs that remained were his left kidney, the diaphragm, the spleen, and the large intestine. The boy who had been returned to his homeland was an empty vessel. The German post-mortem confirmed the initial, baffling finding from Malta. There were no broken bones, a fact that all but ruled out the possibility of a high-velocity fall. But this new discovery of the missing organs cast a shadow of unsettling mystery that couldn't be ignored. How could a body simply be missing nearly all its vital organs? Baron Mansholt, his grief now hardened into cold, unwavering resolve, demanded answers. The explanation he received from Dr. Mario Siri, the medical legal expert appointed by the Maltese courts, was as bewildering as it was hard to believe. Dr. Siri told the devastated father that his son's organs had likely been consumed by rodents, and that his brain had liquefied in the scorching summer heat. But the thorough German autopsy found absolutely no evidence to support this disturbing claim. There was no sign that animals had invaded the body, except for a small bite mark on the neck and a minor scrape on the forearm. The remains showed none of the extensive damage that would result from a week-long attack by rodents. The German doctors were crystal clear. The rodent theory simply wasn't credible. Then another troubling inconsistency came to light. The body had been officially certified as embalmed before its flight back to Germany, standard procedure for international transport. Yet the second autopsy revealed no trace of formalin or any other embalming fluid. This lack of proper preservation had allowed severe decomposition to set in, making it nearly impossible to determine how death had occurred. With most organs gone, German authorities couldn't rule out causes like suffocation or internal bleeding, methods that leave no marks on bone. The official cause of death remained undetermined. This case had transformed from tragedy into something far more sinister. A web of contradictions, suspicious circumstances, and official stonewalling. And at the heart of it all was Mike's missing GoPro camera. Baron remembered how his son documented everything. If Mike had been cycling, if he'd fallen, or if something else had happened, he would almost certainly have been recording. That camera held the key to his final moments, the potential to solve this entire mystery. Baron's inquiries about the GoPro met with a maddening, ever-shifting story. He would later state that Malta's lead investigator had initially told him on 3 separate occasions, with witnesses present, that a GoPro had indeed been found on his son's belt. Baron pleaded and pressured for access to it. Each time, she confirmed she knew what a GoPro was, and that one had been recovered. But when he was finally shown a camera from the forensics department, it wasn't Mike's silver GoPro Hero 2.0. Instead, it was an old, battered Canon camera with a destroyed memory chip, a useless piece of junk with no connection to his son whatsoever. Mike's actual camera, along with his backpack, wallet, and phone, were never found, officially declared as unrecovered from the scene. For Baron Mansholt, a line had been crossed. This was no longer mere incompetence. The inconsistencies were too glaring, the explanations too flimsy. What had seemed like a neatly closed case of accidental death was unraveling, revealing what he could only see as a deliberate, systematic cover-up. The goldsmith from Oldenburg put his entire life and business on hold. His grief, raw and consuming, became fuel for a new, all-encompassing mission. He would become the detective his son's case desperately needed. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. His search for answers became a 2-year odyssey, a grueling journey into the depths of a mystery that seemed to grow darker and more twisted with every step. He returned to Malta again and again, a solitary, determined figure against the backdrop of an island that seemed intent on forgetting his son. He walked the dusty paths at Dingley Cliffs, trying to see what his son had seen, trying to understand what had happened in those final terrible moments. He questioned potential witnesses, piecing together fragments of a timeline, searching for anyone who might have seen Mike on that fateful day. His investigation revealed a pattern of what he saw as official indifference and obstruction. Crucial evidence seemed to have simply vanished. Hundreds of photos were reportedly taken at the scene on July 26th, but they never appeared in the official case file sent to German authorities. A local farmer from Dingley was mentioned in early reports, but there was no evidence he'd ever been properly investigated. The entire Maltese investigation appeared to Baron as nothing more than a superficial exercise, designed to close the book on an inconvenient death as quickly as possible. The family's suspicions about the missing organs crystallized into a specific, chilling theory. Baron began to believe that the Maltese forensic team had rushed through the autopsy, removed Mike's organs for some unknown purpose, perhaps for disposal, perhaps for university research, and then invented the rodent story to cover their tracks. This horrifying theory gained disturbing context when the family learned of a report by the late Maltese investigative journalist Daphne Caruana. She had once written about a local politician and doctor who had boasted of taking organs from the morgue to study at home during his time as a medical student. While not directly connected to Mike's case, this revelation painted a troubling picture. It suggested a culture of negligence and potential misconduct within Malta's medical system that made Baron's theory seem far less outlandish than it might have appeared. Armed with a damning report from the German autopsy, the Mansholt family began their fight back through official channels. They filed a court application before Magistrate Marcin Fuguja, the same magistrate who had conducted the original inquiry. Their demands were clear: investigate what happened to their son's organs and explain why the body had been falsely certified as embalmed. They petitioned the police commissioner to investigate and prosecute, but they hit a wall of bureaucratic silence. Their requests were turned down in August 2018. However, under mounting pressure from the family and growing media attention, the case was briefly reopened in Malta. The inquiry reached the exact same conclusion as before. Mike had probably died from a fall. The Maltese Attorney General's office issued a public statement. They expressed sympathy for the family, but firmly dismissed their claims. The allegations of murder, the statement read, have found no reasonable basis. The AG's office warned against conspiracy theories and speculation, insisting that the family had been given full access to the findings, and that all authorities had acted with complete fairness and objectivity. For Baron, this felt like the ultimate betrayal. He had presented Maltese authorities with a mountain of contradictions and forensic evidence from one of Germany's most respected medical universities. Yet they clung to a narrative that defied both logic and science. The official story remained unchanged. A boy fell off a cliff, but didn't break any bones. His organs were consumed by rats that left no trace, and his state-of-the-art action camera, which he took everywhere, had somehow transformed into a broken old device. I no longer believe Mike was alone when he died, Barron told the Times of Malta years later, his voice heavy with the weight of his long, lonely fight. At least one other person must have been present. There is no other way of explaining the circumstances. I have a theory about what happened at Dingley Cliffs on July 18th, 2016. And he's never publicly revealed the full details of his theory, holding it back as a card to be played in a legal battle that he refuses to abandon. The battle has moved to a European stage. In 2021, the Manshout family, through their lawyers, initiated a process to obtain a European investigation order. This legal mechanism would compel German courts to formally request that Maltese authorities reopen the investigation. A cross-border judicial order that Malta, under EU principles of mutual recognition, would be bound to execute. It represents the family's last best hope to force a genuine, transparent investigation into the questions that have haunted them for years. How did Mike die? Who was with him? And what happened to his organs? The case of Mike Manshout is a story without an ending. It's a haunting portrait of a young life cut short and a family trapped in an endless cycle of grief and unanswered questions. It's the story of a father's unwavering love, a love so powerful it transformed a humble goldsmith into a fearless investigator, a man willing to take on an entire state in his quest for truth. The mystery remains suspended in time, as stark and unsettling as the view from Dingley Cliffs. Was it simply a tragic accident compounded by a series of bizarre and incompetent mistakes? Or was it something more sinister? A robbery that turned violent? A cover-up designed to protect someone? Or to preserve the pristine, sun-drenched reputation of an island paradise? Story 2. The August air in Austin, Texas hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket of heat that promised no relief, even as the sun began its slow descent. For Jennifer Raycave, however, the oppressive summer of 2005 was a season of hope. At 21, she was a young woman standing on the edge of a new beginning, a fresh start she desperately needed. Jennifer had the kind of infectious enthusiasm that drew people to her like a magnet. Her bright, bubbly personality masked a deeper vulnerability beneath the surface. She'd moved to Austin with dreams of earning a college degree, enrolling at Texas State University in San Marcos. But the academic world had proven to be a poor fit. She dropped out after just one semester, a detour that left her adrift in a city that could be as unforgiving as it was exciting. She'd taken jobs as a waitress, navigating the unpredictable world of Austin's service industry, while briefly attending community college. But Jennifer was battling more than just academic uncertainty. Her friends and family knew about her struggle with substances, a recurring fight between her desire for a stable life and the pull of a darker, more chaotic scene. Now, finally, a real opportunity had emerged from the haze. On August 16th, she walked into a local law firm for what was meant to be a one-day filing job. She threw herself into the work with such enthusiasm that by day's end, they offered her a full-time position as a legal assistant. A steady job with a real future. That evening, she was practically buzzing with excitement. She called her mother, Sharon, her roommate, and her ex-boyfriend, her voice brimming with the promise of this new chapter. By 8:30 p.m., she was in her pajamas, ready for an early night so she'd be fresh for her first official day. "Make sure I wake up in the morning," she told her roommate. A simple request that would later carry tragic irony. But the quiet night she'd planned was not to be. Around 9:30 p.m., she spoke to a friend, Michael Rodriguez, telling him she was going to see a friend named Colton, who was having some problems. That friend was Colton Aaron Petoniak, a 22-year-old junior at the prestigious University of Texas. On the surface, Colton was the picture of success, a National Merit Scholar from a private Catholic high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. He come to UT on a scholarship. Admitted to the competitive business school, he was handsome, clean-cut, and from a respectable upper-middle-class family. But behind the polished facade was a young man spiraling into a world of substance and alcohol abuse. His family knew of his struggles, but they didn't know the full extent. That he wasn't just using but dealing, and that his life was becoming increasingly out of control. The relationship between Jennifer and Colton was ill-defined. They weren't a couple, not in any traditional sense. To her friends, he was primarily her source for substances, a connection to a world she was trying to leave behind. That night, however, he was a friend in need, and Jennifer, ever the loyal friend, decided to go to him. Their night began on Austin's infamous 6th Street, the city's throbbing heart of bars and live music. They met up with some of Jennifer's acquaintances at a bar called Treasure Island, the group sharing a few drinks at a table. While Jennifer chatted with her girlfriends, Colton was on his phone, setting up deals. Around midnight, the group decided to move on to another bar called Cheers. But at the door, Colton pulled Jennifer aside. The two of them were last seen walking away together, disappearing into the humid Austin night. A little after midnight, Jennifer called Michael Rodriguez's daughter. She told him that the only people who could help Colton were in jail. She didn't sound scared or anxious, just matter-of-fact. She said she would call him back. An hour later, she called again. This time, her voice was strained. She described Colton as intoxicated and angry. Michael could hear her yelling in the background. "What are you doing? That is not my car." And then, oh my God, he's urinating on that car. Still, she didn't ask for help. She didn't sound like she was in danger. It was the last time anyone other than her killer would hear her voice. Sometime between that final phone call and 3:30 a.m. Inside Colton Petoniak's apartment at the Orange Tree Condominiums in West Campus, Jennifer Cave was killed. It was, as a prosecutor would later describe it, a very clean act. A single bullet from a .380 Smith & Wesson handgun was fired through her right arm, traveled into her chest, and tore through her heart, ending her life almost instantly. The act itself was swift, brutal, and final. But what happened next was a descent into a level of depravity that would shock even seasoned investigators. Alone in his apartment with Jennifer's lifeless body, Colton Petoniak didn't panic in any logical way. He didn't call the police. He didn't run. Instead, he began a grotesque and methodical process that would horrify everyone who learned of it. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted. What followed was an unthinkable act of violence that would shock even seasoned investigators. Then came something even more disturbing. In an act of unimaginable cruelty, he began to harm her body further. The prosecutor's words would later haunt everyone in that courtroom. It was the post-murder behavior that made it so grotesque. The mutilation was pure anger. It wasn't any effort to hide the body or dispose of evidence. It was just playing with it like it was a toy. In the early hours of the morning, his gruesome work still unfinished, Colton went to see a neighbor, Nora Sullivan. He was rambling, spinning a bizarre story about a gunfight with two Mexican men. He claimed he'd fired 2 shots and might have hit someone. He showed her his gun, then asked if he had blood on him. She noticed a small smear on his arm. After leaving Nora's place, he started sending text messages to Laura Ashley Hall. Laura was a fellow UT student who had once been Colton's girlfriend. But her feelings for him ran much deeper and were far more obsessive than his ever were for her. At 6:00 a.m., they connected on a 13-minute phone call. Whatever was said during those 13 minutes sealed Laura Hall's fate. It tied her forever to the horrific events unfolding in Colton's apartment. Later that morning, while Jennifer's new colleagues at the law firm were wondering where their enthusiastic new hire could be, Colton Patak was shopping. He walked into Breed's Hardware, less than a mile from his apartment, and bought a hacksaw, safety masks, ammonia, and cleaning supplies. He told the clerk he needed the saw to cut up a turkey he was frying. The surveillance video showed he was completely alone. On his way back to the apartment, he stopped at Burger King, as if this were just another ordinary morning. Back in the apartment, the horror continued. That hacksaw he'd just purchased? It was later found resting on Jennifer's body. And then came one final, chilling act of violence. The next morning, August 17th, the law firm called Jennifer's mother, Sharon Cave, in Corpus Christi. Jennifer hadn't shown up for work. Sharon, who was incredibly close to her daughter and spoke to her several times every day, felt panic surge through her chest. She immediately started calling Jennifer's friends. She reached Michael Rodriguez, who told her about those strange phone calls from the night before. Then Colton Patak returned one of Sharon's calls. He was calm, casual, and he lied completely. He told her he hadn't seen Jennifer. Michael, still on the other line with Sharon, immediately spoke up. He's lying. The knot of fear in Sharon's stomach tightened like a vice. She and her fiancé, Jim Sedgwick, drove straight to Austin on August 18th. They went directly to the Orange Tree condominiums, where they found Jennifer's car parked outside. They pounded on Colton's door, yelling for Jennifer, their desperate voices swallowed by the indifferent city heat. The police arrived, but delivered crushing news to the distraught family. They couldn't enter the apartment without a warrant. As the officers left, Jim Sedgwick made a decision born of pure desperation. He couldn't wait any longer. He had managed to unlock a window earlier, and now he climbed through it into the darkened apartment. The air inside felt still and heavy. He moved through typical college clutter, but noticed the kitchen was spotless, almost unnaturally clean. On the coffee table, 2 shell casings caught his eye. Then he walked into the bathroom. What he saw in that bathtub would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. It was Jennifer, but a version of her so violated, so desecrated, that she was barely recognizable. Her body lay in the tub, and nearby, a garbage bag contained what remained. Jim didn't stay long enough to absorb the full horror. He scrambled back out of the apartment and called 911 again. When Sharon tried to go inside to see for herself, he had to physically hold her back, protecting her from the nightmare that waited within. While Jennifer's family was making their horrific discovery, Colton Patak and Laura Hall were already running. At 8:34 p.m. The previous night, Colton had spoken to Sharon Cave one final time, telling her he was eating pizza with friends and that she and the police should leave him alone. Immediately after that call, his cell phone records showed him traveling south on Interstate 35, on a clear path toward the Mexican border. He and Laura crossed into Pedras Negras at 2:41 a.m. In her green Cadillac. For 5 days, they partied in Mexico like nothing had happened. They even went with a hotel clerk to watch an Ultimate Fighting Championship match. Colton, in a moment of chilling detachment, casually inquired about extradition laws and whether they could sell Laura's car to travel deeper into Mexico. But their flight from justice would be short-lived. Tips from Crime Stoppers led Mexican authorities straight to their hotel. On August 23rd, a Mexican SWAT team took them into custody. They were driven to the International Bridge at Eagle Pass, Texas, where us marshals stood waiting. Colton Pataniak was arrested for the murder of Jennifer Cave. Laura Hall was, for the moment, allowed to go free. The trial of Colton Pataniak began in January 2007. The prosecution, led by Bill Bishop and Stephanie McFarland, made a calculated strategic decision. They would charge him only with murder, not the lesser offenses of manslaughter or criminally negligent homicide. They wanted to force the defense to explain exactly what had happened in that apartment during the early morning hours of August 17th. Colton's defense was simple yet troubling. He claimed to have no memory of the murder. Taking the stand, he testified that he'd been on a days-long bender of drugs and alcohol. When he finally woke up, he said he found Jennifer's body in the bathtub. He admitted that he must have been the one who shot her, but he pointed the finger at Laura Hall for what came next. According to Colton, she had orchestrated the dismemberment. He painted Laura as the mastermind, claiming she had made a list of items to buy from the hardware store, and that fleeing to Mexico had been her idea. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They painted a vivid picture of Colton as a man completely fascinated by the gangster lifestyle. They showed the jury his online screen names, Coney and Ill of Money Andos. They pointed to his favorite movies, Donnie Brasco and Goodfellas, both of which feature disturbing scenes involving body dismemberment. In his apartment, police had discovered a Sopranos DVD, one where a character dismembers a body in a bathtub. Even the large Scarface movie poster hanging in his kitchen suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before finding Colton Petaniak guilty of murder. After powerful and heart-wrenching testimony from Sharon Cave about the devastating impact of her daughter's death, the jury sentenced him to 55 years in prison. Laura Hall's legal journey proved far more complex. In 2007, she was convicted of tampering with evidence and hindering apprehension for her role in the dismemberment and their flight to Mexico. She received a sentence of 5 years, relatively light, suggesting the jury remained divided on her true level of responsibility. But her legal troubles were far from over. In 2010, she was resentenced and received the maximum possible term: 10 years for tampering with evidence and 1 year for hindering apprehension, to be served at the same time. Throughout her trials, Laura Hall's story shifted like sand. At first, she claimed to know nothing, to have never even seen the body. Then her story changed. She admitted seeing the body but insisted she didn't know what had happened. Finally, she claimed to be a victim herself, kidnapped by Colton and forced into compliance. But the evidence painted a very different picture. Her DNA was found on the murder weapon and on a flip-flop in the bathroom. Witnesses, including a former cellmate, testified that Laura had made deeply incriminating statements about her involvement. She had even boasted about the dismemberment, callously referring to Jennifer as nothing and nobody. Despite the convictions, one haunting question remained unanswered. Why? A clear motive for the murder was never established. Why did Colton Petaniak, a promising young student, so brutally kill a woman he called a friend? And what was Laura Hall's true role in the horrific aftermath that followed? Was she a lovesick young woman, manipulated by a sociopath, as her defense attorney claimed? Or was she a willing and cruel participant in the desecration of Jennifer Cave's body? The evidence was confounding. The testimonies contradictory. In the years that followed, the case of Jennifer Cave continued to haunt the Austin community and beyond. Colton Petaniak remains in prison, serving his 55-year sentence. Laura Hall was released on parole in 2018, her sentence completed. The case stands as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary surface. It speaks to the devastating, inexplicable violence that can erupt in a single moment, extinguishing a bright young life and leaving behind a trail of shattered families and questions that may never find their answers. Story 3. The thick Rio de Janeiro air, heavy with summer's promise and the endless hum of a city that never sleeps, had always energized Jefferson Machado da Costa. To everyone who knew him, he was simply Jeff, a man whose 44 years told the story of chasing a dream with unwavering determination. Born in the quiet, smaller town of Ararangua in Santa Catarina, Jeff had felt Rio's magnetic pull from an early age. The vibrant, artistic scene called to him like a siren song. In 1997, armed with little more than raw ambition, he made his move to the sprawling metropolis. His mission? To carve out a career as an actor. But his journey was far from a straight shot to stardom. Instead, it became a winding road filled with auditions, small parts, and stretches where his other talents had to carry him forward. Jeff was a qualified journalist, a creative soul who could turn his hand to production, art direction, and even styling. For a full decade, he rode the competitive waves between Rio and Sao Paulo. Then in 2008, he returned home to Santa Catarina, working as a press assessor and social columnist. His name began appearing in local magazines, building his reputation. But the dream of the screen? It never faded. In 2014, Rio called him back. This time, he was determined to stay for good. Jeff's life in the Guatiba neighborhood was filled with a very special kind of love. He was a devoted father, not to children, but to 8 setter dogs. Each one was a cherished family member. Their boundless energy filled his home with constant joy and unconditional affection that kept him grounded. Everyone who knew Jeff understood his passion for those dogs. He was simply not a man who would ever willingly part with them. By 2022, his persistence finally seemed to be paying off. He landed a role as a Philistine soldier in the popular record TV soap opera Rai. Sure, it wasn't a leading role, but it was a significant credit, a real foothold in the industry he dedicated his life to pursue. For Jeff, this felt like confirmation. All those sacrifices hadn't been for nothing. The dream was finally within reach. It was in this atmosphere of rising hope that Bruno Duza Rodriguez entered his life. They'd met about 4 years earlier, and Bruno presented himself as a man of real influence. In artistic circles, he was known as Bruno Larrubia, a producer who claimed to have an inside track at Rede Globo, Brazil's largest television network. Here's the thing, he had indeed worked there. But his employment had ended back in 2018. To an aspiring actor like Jeff, Bruno seemed like a beacon of opportunity. He spoke the language of casting calls and contracts fluently, dangling the promise of life-changing roles just within reach. Bruno told Jeff he could secure him a coveted part in a new Globo soap opera. But such a favor came at a price. Over time, Jeff paid him around $20,000, an investment in a future he believed was just around the corner. As 2022 drew to a close, Bruno's schemes deepened. In December, he rented a modest house on Rua Atura in Campo Grande, a working-class neighborhood in Rio's West Zone. It sat more than 12 miles from Jeff's home. Almost immediately, he began making strange renovations, raising the property's walls higher and higher. A neighbor would later remember seeing Jeff there a few times, a visitor in what would become his own tomb. The web was being woven, thread by insidious thread. In January 2023, a new player entered the scene. Jeff met Gender Vinicius D. Silva Braga, a 29-year-old who worked odd jobs as a mason and baker through a dating app. Gender began spending time at Jeff's house, his life becoming entangled with both the hopeful actor and the manipulative producer who was slowly closing his trap. The carefully crafted illusion Bruno had built began to fray. Jeff, growing impatient and perhaps suspicious, started pressing Bruno harder about the promised role. He may have spoken to others, slowly piecing together a disturbing truth. He wasn't the only aspiring artist to have been fooled by the smooth-talking producer. That $20,000 wasn't an investment. It was the price of an elaborate lie. As Jeff's discovery began unraveling Bruno's scam, the producer realized he was cornered. The deception couldn't be maintained any longer, and the consequences of his fraud were finally catching up to him. The plot shifted from simple deceit to something far darker. On January 23, 2023, Jeff Machado spoke to his family for the last time. He called his mother, Maria dos Dores, his voice carrying that familiar warmth she knew so well. He called every single day. It was their ritual of connection, bridging the distance between Rio and Santa Catarina. But after that day, The call stopped completely. In their place came text messages, a form of communication that immediately felt wrong to his mother. The messages were awkward and filled with spelling errors that didn't sound like Jeff at all. One claimed his phone had fallen into the toilet, explaining why he couldn't call. Another announced he was moving to São Paulo for work. When Maria asked about his beloved dogs, the reply said he would leave them with a friend. For her, this was the most glaring alarm bell of all. Jefferson wasn't going to leave the dogs with friends, she later recounted. This isn't right. A gnawing anxiety began settling in her heart. She knew the truth, even if she couldn't yet prove it. The person on the other end of those messages wasn't Jeff. It was Bruno, using Jeff's own phone to create a digital ghost, a puppet whose strings he pulled to delay the inevitable discovery. On January 24th, just one day after Jeff was last heard from, something strange appeared on his Instagram account. A picture surfaced with the caption "Re-energizing gratitude," followed by a string of hashtags. A week later, on February 2nd, another post emerged. "Restart gratitude." Friends and fans immediately noticed the odd wording and spelling mistakes scattered through the comments. This was a complete departure from Jeff's normally polished, articulate style. Then, a supposed farewell letter appeared on his account. But while Bruno worked to maintain this digital charade, the most heartbreaking evidence of Jeff's absence came to light. On January 27th, just 4 days after he vanished, Jeff's 8 setter dogs were discovered wandering the streets near his home. They were abandoned, distressed, and clearly in need of help. An animal welfare organization rescued them, and thanks to their microchips, they were able to identify Jeff as the owner and reach out to his family. For everyone who knew him, this was the unmistakable sign that something had gone terribly wrong. His friend Sina Hilson knew it instantly. Meanwhile, the last person seen with Jeff, the one who should have been leading the search efforts, offered no help whatsoever. As the family's panic grew, Bruno played his role as the concerned friend perfectly. When Jeff's brother Diego flew to Rio to file a missing person report, Bruno even accompanied him to the police station. He boldly admitted to having Jeff's house keys, car keys, and bank cards, claiming Jeff had asked him to hold on to them. He even went so far as to hire lawyers to follow the case. It was such an audacious move that it only deepened police suspicion. While the family held on to hope and prayed for a miracle, Bruno was busy using Jeff's credit cards. The transactions started on January 23rd, the very day Jeff was killed. First, a small purchase of $22, followed by larger amounts in the days that followed, $680. Then, 2 separate charges of $750 each. Bruno wasn't just impersonating Jeff. He was systematically destroying his life, piece by piece. The investigation, handled by the Whereabouts Discovery Police Station, began shifting away from the theory of voluntary disappearance. Testimony from the Animal Welfare Organization and Jeff's friends, combined with Bruno Rodriguez's increasingly bizarre behavior, pointed towards something far more sinister. For 4 agonizing months, the family waited. Maria dos Dores clung to the fragile hope that her son was alive somewhere, that this nightmare would somehow end with his safe return. But on May 22nd, 2023, that hope was brutally shattered. Acting on a tip, investigators arrived at a rented house on Rua Itera in Campo Grande. In the backyard, they discovered a freshly laid patch of concrete. Police footage captured the grim scene that followed. Half a dozen officers breaking through the solid slab, digging deep into the earth beneath. 2 meters down, they struck something hard and hollow, a wooden chest. As they lifted the heavy trunk from the ground, a wave of dread settled over everyone present. Inside, they found the body of Jeff Machado. He was unclothed, folded into a fetal position, his arms bound behind his head. A thin wire was wrapped tightly around his neck, clear evidence of strangulation. The coroner would later confirm he had been suffocated. The trunk, police quickly realized, was identical to one from Jeff's own home. A final, cruel twist. He had been buried in his own possession. They were able to identify him through his fingerprints. The 4-month search was finally over. Now, with a body recovered, the puzzle pieces began falling rapidly into place. The motive became crystal clear. Bruno had deceived Jeff with false promises of an acting role. When Jeff discovered the lie, Bruno killed him to keep him quiet and cover up the fraud. Under interrogation, the suspect's stories began crumbling apart. Between May 26th and 27th, both Bruno and Gender gave their statements. Bruno initially denied any involvement whatsoever. Gender, however, confessed to helping transport and bury the body, though he claimed he was merely an accomplice, pressured into helping by Bruno. He even named a third man, a supposed militia member named Marcelo. But police dismissed this as a desperate attempt to shift blame elsewhere. Together, they invented a story claiming Jeff had been killed accidentally during the filming of an intimate video that went wrong. But after his arrest, Gender changed his story completely. He admitted that Bruno had drugged and strangled Jeff, and that he had only helped conceal the body. He denied that any intimate activity had taken place, though the coroner's report suggested it had occurred before the murder. The investigation concluded that Bruno killed Jeff following a physical confrontation, strangling him with a telephone cord. Gender, who worked as a mason, was the one who dug the 2-meter-deep hole in the backyard and helped Bruno pour concrete over the buried trunk. With Gender's confession, the case solidified. On June 1st, 2023, arrest warrants were issued for both men on charges of homicide and concealment of a corpse. Gender Vinicius D. Silva Braga was arrested the very next day in the Santissimo neighborhood of Rio. Bruno Duza Rodriguez, however, had vanished. Now a fugitive, his name was added to Interpol's international wanted list as a worldwide manhunt began. For nearly 2 weeks, he remained on the run. Police tracked him down after he made the mistake of using a Wi-Fi network in Moraro do Vatejo, a sprawling favela in Rio's South Zone. On June 15th, they finally closed in. They found him hiding in a building, his appearance completely changed in a desperate attempt to slip away from justice. When October 2023 arrived, the first phase of the trial began. 18 witnesses took the stand, including Jeff's own mother and brother. The prosecution carefully laid out the full, devastating scope of the defendant's crimes. In August 2025, Judge Alessandra de Rocha Lamaros made her ruling. Both Bruno and Gender would face a jury trial. Bruno found himself charged with a truly staggering list of offenses. Quadruply aggravated homicide, driven by pure greed, using methods that prevented the victim's defense and committed to secure profit from another crime. Concealment of a corpse. Fraud, theft from the victim's estate. Invasion of an electronic device. False identity. And animal cruelty for abandoning Jeff's 8 dogs. Gender faced charges of qualified homicide, concealment of a corpse, and animal cruelty. The decision to move forward with a full jury trial felt like a small victory for Jeff's family. Their lawyer, Hiro Magol, put it simply: now it will be up to society, represented by the jurors, to analyze the facts and do justice. Our commitment is to the truth and the memory of the victim. For Maria dos Dores, the emotional weight of these proceedings was almost unbearable. But she remained steadfast, determined to be there in that courtroom alongside her son, Diego. They wait for the final trial now, not seeking vengeance, but hoping for some semblance of peace. A final, formal accounting for the man who was stolen from them. A man of boundless dreams, whose life was snuffed out by greed and heartless deception. The story of Jeff Machado began with the bright lights of Rio, but it ended in a dark concrete tomb. His family, however, ensures his memory will never be buried with him. Story 4. The cold of a Quebec winter has a way of seeping into everything. It frosts the glass, bites at exposed skin, and sometimes it seems to find its way into the hidden fissures of the human heart, freezing what was once warm, turning it brittle, For Dr. Guy Turcotte and Dr. Isabelle Gaston, the winter of 2009 would bring a cold so profound it would shatter their world completely, leaving behind a silence that could never be filled. To the outside world, they were a portrait of success. Two doctors, intelligent, driven, building a life together in the quiet, affluent suburbs north of Montreal. They had met in Quebec City back in 1999, two bright minds drawn to one another. A year later, they moved in together. Guy was a cardiologist, a specialist who dealt with the intricate mechanics of the human heart. Isabelle worked as an emergency room physician and coroner, a woman who confronted life's most abrupt and tragic endings every single day. Their professions placed them at the very nexus of life and death, a place of high stakes and immense pressure. They built a family. Their son Olivier was born, a bright, energetic boy who would grow to be 5. Then came their daughter, Sophie, a sweet 3-year-old girl who completed their home. Guy's brother would later recall just how attentive Guy was, not just to his own children, but to his nieces and nephews, too. When Guy played with the kids, you could see the pure, uncomplicated joy lighting up his face. He seemed to have as much fun as they did. By many accounts, he was a devoted father, a man who seemed to find a softer, more genuine version of himself whenever his children were near. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect family, the foundation was cracking. The relationship between Guy and Isabelle was filled with tension that sometimes erupted into open hostility. There were arguments, moments of domestic strife so sharp they led to Guy moving out, only for them to reconcile shortly after. Buoyed by promises to work on their relationship, it was during one of these periods of renewed hope that Guy proposed to Isabelle on a trip to Mount Washington. She accepted. They moved forward, layering new commitments over old wounds. They were both professionals, accustomed to dealing with stress. But the stress of their own home? That was different, more insidious. Isabelle would later speak of a marriage where she felt she could never be perfect enough in her husband's eyes. A constant, low-grade pressure to meet some unstated ideal. Guy, in turn, was a man who struggled to express his emotions. A man with narcissistic traits who tended to intellectualize his feelings, keeping them locked away until they could no longer be contained. The love was there, but it was tangled with resentment and a failure to truly connect. The final fracture came not from an explosive argument, but from a quiet betrayal. In mid-January of 2009, the family was planning a trip to Mexico, a sunny escape from the Canadian winter. Just before they were set to leave, Guy Turcotte learned that his wife was having an affair. The other man wasn't a stranger. He was Martin Huet, their personal trainer, a man Guy considered a friend. The news was delivered by Huet's own girlfriend, who provided irrefutable proof, a string of emails between Isabelle and her lover. The betrayal was absolute. Turcotte felt it like a physical blow. He was angry, wounded, but he didn't cancel the trip. The 4 of them, Guy, Isabelle, Olivier, and Anne-Sophie, went to Mexico, a family already broken, performing a pantomime of togetherness under the tropical sun. The decision was made there. Amidst the palm trees and the sound of the ocean, they would separate. 2 days after they returned to the snow-covered landscape of Quebec, Turcotte packed his belongings and left the family home. Isabelle and the children remained. They agreed to share custody, a modern, civilized arrangement that belied the turmoil churning beneath. But civility was just a thin veneer. The separation opened the floodgates to a torrent of spiteful conversations and escalating bitterness. The man who had once been the center of his family was now on the outside, looking in, and the view was maddening. On February 8th, just a few weeks into the new arrangement, Guy received a piece of information that felt, in his own words, like a hammer to the head. Isabelle had taken the children to the Carnival de Quebec, a winter festival that held special meaning for him, as he had lived in Quebec City for many years. And they hadn't gone alone. Martin Hewitt had been with them. The image of this other man, this man who had stolen his wife, now stepping into his place with his children. It was unbearable. I could not accept that Martin spent time with my children as if I was being replaced, he later testified. The next day, the wound was torn open even further. A former neighbor casually informed him that on the very day he had moved out, Martin Hewitt had spent the night at the house. He had been staying there almost every night for the past 2 weeks. The information Turcotte received hit him like a physical blow. The fear of being replaced had transformed into something far worse. It was now his reality. His home, his bed, his family. Another man was living his life. On February 10th, all that simmering rage finally erupted. He drove to the house, his house, with the simple excuse of picking up his son's sweater. There in the kitchen, the very heart of what had once been his home, he found him. Martin Hewitt. The two men stood face to face in that familiar space that no longer belonged to him. "You stole my wife. You betrayed me. You were my friend," Turcotte said, each word dripping with raw pain and fury. Without warning, he threw a punch, connecting hard with Hewitt's face before turning and walking away. That single moment of violence became a turning point, the punctuation mark on his downward spiral. The days that followed crawled by in slow, burning agony. Here was a man accustomed to being in complete control, now watching everything that mattered slip through his fingers. He was a cardiologist who could no longer regulate the frantic, painful rhythm of his own shattered life. Friday, February 20th, 2009, began like any other day in his fractured new reality. He went to work at the hospital, and his colleagues noticed nothing unusual. After all, he was a doctor, trained to maintain that professional mask, to keep his compartments sealed tight. He exchanged emails with Isabel. He picked up Olivier from school and little Sophie from daycare, their small hands warm in his, their innocent chatter offering a brief moment of peace. But then he found himself driving past his old house, like a moth helplessly drawn to a flame that would only burn him. Isabel spotted him and demanded he leave. Her words, delivered sharp and cold over the phone, felt like nails being hammered into the coffin of his former life. "You're going to stop controlling my life," she told him. "Now, if I want to, I can change the children's names. I can get custody. I can move anywhere in Quebec." She had consulted a lawyer. She had changed the locks. For Turcotte, this wasn't just her asserting independence. This was a declaration of war. The threat of losing his children, of having their very names erased and replaced, filled him with terror beyond comprehension. His response was ice cold and clipped. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one. That night, alone in the rented house in Piedmont that had become his prison, the carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely. The children slept peacefully in their beds, blissfully unaware of the storm raging within their father's mind. He felt utterly defeated, a hollow shell of the man he once was. The tears he'd held back for so long began to fall. Sitting in the sterile quiet of his temporary life, he opened his laptop and began reading old emails from Isabel. Messages from better times, and then from the moments when everything started falling apart. Each word was a fresh wound, deepening his sense of loss and failure. The pain became unbearable. The future stretched before him like a black void. He wanted it all to end. He turned to the cold, impersonal logic of the internet, searching for ways to escape permanently. The thought of ending his own life became his singular, desperate focus. He found what he was looking for: windshield washer fluid. That blue liquid, filled with deadly methanol, promised a final way out. He went to the garage and brought the container inside. But as he sat there contemplating his own death, another thought began to form in his fractured mind. A twisted, terrible thought born from his distorted love. If he went through with this, who would find him? His children, Olivier and little Sophie. They would wake up in the morning and discover their father's body. The image was a horror he couldn't bear. In that moment of complete mental breakdown, he made a decision that would haunt him forever. He had to spare them that pain. He had to take them with him. He recalled standing in Olivier's room, knife in hand. What happened next was a nightmare he could barely comprehend. His son cried out. A single word of protest and disbelief? No. The boy tried to move away. In that moment, Turcotte would later testify. He realized he was hurting his child. But that realization didn't bring him to his senses. Instead, it triggered a surge of panic. In his fractured state of mind, he couldn't stop. The attack continued in frenzied desperation. 27 times. He had similar nightmarish memories from his daughter's room. 19 times. The same frantic violence from a mind that had completely shattered. Afterward, he found himself in the bathroom. His hands were covered in blood. He had hurt his children, his babies. He drank the blue windshield washer fluid, suicide now serving as an epilogue to a crime he could barely understand. He looked for the knife to finish what he'd started, but couldn't find it. The poison and horror overwhelmed him. He collapsed, crawling under his bed like a wounded animal seeking a dark place to die. The next morning, Saturday, February 21st, Turcotte's mother grew worried. She had spoken to her son the night before, and he had expressed thoughts of ending his life. She called 911. 2 police officers were dispatched to the rented house in Piedmont for a wellness check. They entered the home and were met with an unnatural, heavy silence. Then they made the discovery that would haunt them forever. The lifeless bodies of 2 small children. A boy and a girl in their beds. The scene was one of unimaginable violence. In the master bedroom, they discovered Gur, caught beneath the bed, covered in blood, and barely clinging to consciousness. Through labored breaths, he confessed everything to the officers. He told them about drinking the windshield wiper fluid. He told them he wanted to die, but death had eluded him. Instead, he had only succeeded in destroying everything he had ever loved. The news struck Isabelle Gaston like a physical blow. A force so powerful it knocked the air from her lungs and swept the ground from beneath her feet. She was in the middle of her hospital shift when they told her. This woman who faced tragedy every single day was now standing at the center of the most profound tragedy of all. Her ex-husband, the father of her children, had taken their lives. The grief felt like an ocean, vast and drowning. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else emerged alongside it, a steely resolve for justice. The legal battle that followed would captivate and outrage the entire province of Quebec. Turcotte was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His trial began on April 12, 2011. The heart of his defense wasn't denial. He admitted to taking his children's lives from the very beginning. Instead, his lawyers argued that he was not criminally responsible for his actions due to a mental disorder. They claimed that at the time of the tragedy, Turcotte was suffering from an adjustment disorder with anxiety and depressive moods, a mental state so severe that he was unable to form the intent to kill. He was, they said, a man pushed beyond his breaking point. The collapse of his marriage, the loss of his family, the fear of being replaced, it had all become too much. Defense psychiatrist Dr. Dominique Bourges testified that Turcotte was suffering from a major mental illness that made him incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Another expert, Dr. Louis Morcite, argued that Turcotte had acted to spare his children from the trauma of discovering his body. It was a decision born from a sick mind, not a malicious one. The defense painted a portrait of a man so consumed by suicidal despair that he had lost all contact with reality. Crown prosecutor René Verret presented a starkly different story. This wasn't about mental collapse. This was calculated revenge. Barrett argued that Turcotte was a man in complete control, a narcissist who deliberately took his children's lives to punish Isabel Gaston for leaving him. The prosecution's experts pushed back against the defense, acknowledging that while Turcotte was certainly suffering from an adjustment disorder, this type of condition doesn't rob a person of their ability to reflect or understand the consequences of their actions. The timing of the methanol ingestion became a crucial battleground. Turcotte and his defense team insisted he drank the windshield washer fluid before the tragedy in a genuine suicide attempt, that the decision to harm the children came after. The Crown argued the complete opposite. Barrett pointed to the evidence. Blood was found on the washer fluid containers, suggesting he had handled them after the attacks. A medical assessment on the night of his arrest concluded that he had ingested the poison no more than 90 minutes before arriving at the hospital, after the children were already gone. This, the Crown contended, wasn't a suicide attempt that led to tragedy, but tragedy followed by a half-hearted attempt to fake suicide. On July 5th, 2011, after a long and harrowing trial, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Guy Turcotte not criminally responsible by reason of mental disorder. A wave of shock and outrage swept through Quebec. To many, it seemed that a man who had admitted to stabbing his 2 children, a total of 46 times, was essentially getting away with it. Isabel Gaston was devastated. The justice system had failed her children. Turcotte was sent to the Philippe Institute, a psychiatric hospital in Montreal. In 2012, after just over a year of treatment, he appeared before a mental health review board and declared himself ready for release. He said he felt less shame, less guilt, had more self-esteem, and was no longer a danger to anyone. The board agreed, and he was released, a decision that poured salt on the open wound of public opinion. But the legal story was far from over. The prosecution appealed the verdict, arguing that the trial judge had made a critical error in his instructions to the jury, particularly regarding the issue of self-induced intoxication from the methanol. In November 2013, the Quebec Court of Appeal overturned the verdict and ordered a new trial. The law itself was evolving in the wake of the case, with new federal legislation making it more difficult to obtain an NCR verdict. Turcotte, who had been free, was rearrested and taken back into custody to await his second trial. He was later released on bail in September 2014. The second trial began in September 2015. The arguments were largely the same, a retreading of the same horrific ground. The dueling psychiatrists once again took the stand, presenting their conflicting views of Turcotte's mental state. The jury listened once more to the devastating story that had unfolded, the marriage falling apart, the betrayal of an affair, the changed locks, and that final horrific night. They heard Turcotte's own tearful account, his broken memories of the terrible act he had committed. This time, Isabel Gaston emerged as a stronger voice, a fierce champion for her murdered children. "Today I hope the souls of Olivier and Anne-Sophie can be at peace," she told reporters, her words heavy with grief that hadn't dimmed in the 6 years since their deaths. On December 6, 2015, after 7 long days of deliberation, the second jury came to a different decision. They dismissed the defense of not criminally responsible. They also set aside the charge of first-degree murder, which would have suggested the killings were planned. Instead, they found Guy Turcotte guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict drew a quiet yes from Isabel Gaston's corner of the courtroom. It wasn't the complete victory she might have wished for, but it was recognition. It was confirmation that he bore responsibility. On January 15, 2016, Turcotte was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 17 years. His lawyer would later challenge the parole terms, but the sentence stood firm. The legal battle had finally reached its end. The Guy Turcotte case left lasting wounds on Quebec's collective conscience. It sparked painful discussions about mental illness, family violence, and what justice truly means. It challenged whether our legal system could properly handle acts of such devastating personal violence. But for Isabel Gaston, the woman who had endured this nightmare, the end of the trials didn't mean the end of her suffering. It simply marked the start of a different existence, one forever shadowed by unthinkable loss. A life now devoted to healing, to remembering, and to honoring two precious souls who were taken from her on the coldest night of winter. Story 5. In the rolling hills of central Virginia, where autumn air carries the crisp promise of change, life for Caitlin Elizabeth Lyon Montgomery was a vibrant tapestry woven from love, laughter, and fierce devotion. At 28, she was a woman who her mother described as simply full of life. If anyone truly embraced every moment, it was Caitlin. She moved through the world with an open heart and hands always ready to help anyone in need. Her smile drew people into the warmth of her presence like a beacon in the darkness. But the brightest light in her universe was 4-year-old Milani Rye, a little girl who was the center of her world, the very beat of her heart. Caitlin's life in the forest area of Bedford County followed familiar routines filled with simple joys. She shared an apartment on Madison View Drive with her roommate, Jacob Pyrie, gracefully navigating the daily rhythms of work and single motherhood. But recently, a shadow had fallen across her bright world, a darkness that came from a love that had twisted into something far more dangerous. Her relationship with Trenton Fry, a 28-year-old from Greensboro, North Carolina, had been stormy from the start. What began with promise ultimately became a source of deep pain. In June of 2022, just months before her world would shatter completely, Caitlin suffered a devastating miscarriage. The baby had been Fry's. This shared loss, which might have brought some couples closer together, only seemed to deepen the cracks in their already fragile foundation. By the end of September, Caitlin had made a difficult but necessary decision. She needed to end it. She broke off the relationship, drawing a firm line that she hoped would lead to peace and a fresh start. But Trenton Fry wasn't the kind of man who accepted endings he hadn't written himself. In the week that followed their breakup, the boundary Caitlin had drawn became something he was determined to cross. The separation brought no peace. Instead, it brought a creeping, silent dread. The man who was supposed to be gone remained there, a ghost haunting the edges of her life. What followed was a chilling campaign of stalking, a deliberate effort to watch, to know, to control. In the digital realm, Fry's obsession took on a sinister form. He began searching online for the floor plan of her apartment building, carefully studying the layout of her home, a place that should have been her sanctuary. His phone would later reveal that he spent countless hours lurking in the area around her apartment, a predator circling his prey. His presence was unknown and unfelt, yet undeniably there. He was weaving a web of surveillance, each digital search and reconnaissance mission, another thread in the net he was preparing to cast. The love he had once claimed to feel had twisted into dangerous possessiveness, a desperate need to hold on to what was no longer his, even if it meant destroying it completely. The night of Friday, October 7th, 2022, settled over Bedford County with deceptive calm, anyway. Inside Caitlin's apartment, the evening unfolded with comfortable normalcy. She and Jacob watched TV together, a peaceful end to an ordinary day. Little Milani was tucked safely in her bed, fast asleep. Later, as the house fell into the deep quiet of early morning, something stirred Jacob from his sleep. A sound from the back patio. A subtle disturbance in the night silence. He got up and peered out into the darkness, but saw nothing unusual. He returned to bed, that fleeting moment of unease dissolving back into the night's quiet. But he was wrong. Something was out there. A figure had moved through the shadows, silent and unseen. Trenton Fry, armed with intimate knowledge of her home's layout, and driven by a toxic mixture of rejection and rage, had violated the walls of her sanctuary. While Caitlin, her daughter, and her roommates slept peacefully, the embodiment of her greatest fear was inside, moving through the familiar spaces of her home. What happened next remains locked in the silence of that room, a story told only by the grim evidence left behind. There was no struggle that woke the house, no cry for help that pierced the night. There was only a quiet, brutal act of violence that no one should ever have to endure. As the first hints of dawn approached, the house remained still, the terrible crime a secret held within its walls. Just before 5 in the morning, Fry's movements became a frantic effort to create distance and an alibi. He was in his car, with his phone in hand. At exactly 4:57 a.m., just 3 minutes before Caitlin's daughter would make the discovery that would change her life forever, Fry entered North Carolina into his GPS and began to drive, putting miles between himself and the life he had just stolen. The morning of October 8th broke not with the gentle stirrings of a new day, but with a child's unimaginable terror. Around 5:00 a.m., 4-year-old Milani stirred awake. She padded softly to her mother's room, perhaps seeking a morning cuddle, their familiar ritual. But something was terribly wrong. Her mommy wasn't moving. The little girl, in her innocence, sensed that something was deeply wrong with her mom. She hurried to the roommate's room and gently shook Jacob Pyrie awake. Pyrie followed her back and stepped into Caitlin's room, where he was met with a scene of chilling stillness. The lights blazed overhead, the covers lay scattered off the bed, and there was Caitlin, unresponsive, her vibrant life utterly gone. Panic gripped him. He lunged for the phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice cut through the chaos, a steady presence in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. She guided him through the desperate motions of CPR until help could arrive. First responders flooded the apartment, their urgent movements a stark contrast to the terrible stillness on the bed. Shannon Bale, a firefighter and advanced EMT, would never forget the crushing helplessness of that scene. The patient was unresponsive. She couldn't tell us what happened, Bale would later testify. We just couldn't tell. There was nothing we could do to fix it. They rushed Caitlin to a hospital in nearby Lynchburg, clinging to a sliver of hope. But it was too late. At the hospital, the clinical truth confirmed what their hearts already knew. Caitlin Elizabeth Lyon Montgomery was pronounced dead. The medical examination revealed the devastating nature of the crime. Doctors found petechial hemorrhaging on her face and eyes, tiny burst blood vessels that serve as a telltale sign of asphyxiation. On her neck and throat were linear markings, the clear and brutal signature of strangulation. The cause of death left no mystery. This was a homicide. Investigators from the Bedford County Sheriff's Office descended on the apartment, which was no longer a home, but a crime scene. Their focus quickly narrowed to the bed where Caitlin was discovered. Wrapped up in a blanket were phone-charging cords, believed to be the weapons used to end her life. The suspect became immediately clear. They learned that Caitlin had broken up with her ex-boyfriend Trenton Fry just 1 week before. It was a classic, tragic motive, a story investigators had witnessed play out countless times before. But Fry was gone. He had fled to his home state of North Carolina, checking himself into a hospital, perhaps trying to build a defense, or simply to hide. For 2 weeks, he remained a free man, while the evidence against him mounted. On October 20th, investigators secured a warrant and arrested Trenton Fry for the murder of the woman who had tried to leave him. The trial of Trenton Fry began in the spring of 2025, nearly 2.5 years after Caitlin's death. In the Bedford County courtroom, Commonwealth Attorney Wes Nance laid out the prosecution's case, painting a portrait of a deliberate, premeditated crime born of obsessive jealousy. From my perspective, I think his constant flow of lies to law enforcement played a big role, Nance would later say. But we also wouldn't have been here without the flow of digital evidence. The prosecution presented their damning timeline. The digital footprints Fry had left behind, the searches for her floor plan, the cell phone data that placed him in her neighborhood for hours, and the final damning GPS entry for North Carolina just minutes before Caitlin's body was discovered. The defense, led by attorney Joseph Sensoni, argued that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no direct proof that placed Trenton Fry inside that apartment on that fateful night. What matters is what happened inside that apartment, Sanson argued in his closing statement. Until they have some proof my client was inside that apartment, nothing in this case can be proved by the Commonwealth. Not one thing. Then, in a risky move, Trenton Fry himself took the stand. He admitted to much of what the prosecution alleged. He admitted to being in the area of Caitlin's apartment. He admitted to watching from a distance as first responders swarmed the home. But he denied ever going inside. He testified that he had a bad feeling that drew him there. And when he saw the ambulance and police cars, he panicked and fled to North Carolina. It was a story that asked the jury to believe in a remarkable, tragic coincidence. The jury did not believe him. On April 3rd, 2025, after deliberating for just 1 hour, they returned their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. A wave of emotion washed over the courtroom. Caitlin's friends and family, who had sat through every gut-wrenching detail of the trial, embraced. Tears of relief mingling with the ever-present tears of grief. Nothing will ever make this better, but Trenton Fry being held accountable for his actions does bring our family a little bit of peace, said Tina Hopkins, Caitlin's aunt. Caitlin was the brightest light in the room. We will continue to be her voice. The sentencing came on August 18th, 2025. Trenton Fry stood before the court, his voice barely above a whisper as he offered his apology to the family whose world he had torn apart. I probably have not felt it on the level that you all have, but I have felt it for her loss, he said. And I truly am sorry for the loss that you have experienced. His words hung in the air, swallowed by a silence thick with grief and pain. When the judge rose to deliver the sentence, his voice carried the weight of what he had witnessed. He spoke of the chilling nature of the crime, calling the murder as cold-blooded and premeditated as any he had ever seen. The sentence came down like a final curtain: life in prison. For Caitlin's mother, Crystal Sale, the verdict brought a bittersweet sense of closure. It makes me feel good that we got life, what we wanted, and that Trenton will never be able to harm or kill another woman, she said. But it doesn't bring Caitlin back, unfortunately, and I wish it did. The legal battle had reached its end, but Caitlin Montgomery's story didn't close with that prison sentence. It lives on in the memory of her boundless love for life. It continues through her family's new mission. Rising from the ashes of their devastating loss, they pledged to honor her memory by raising awareness about the dangers of domestic violence. They're determined to use the darkness of their tragedy to bring light and safety to others. Caitlin, the woman who took anybody by the hand to help them, continues to do so through the legacy her family now builds in her name. The brightest light in the room had been extinguished, but her warmth, her spirit, and her voice would not be silenced. Story 6. The first week of September at Joppatown High School should have been a time of fresh starts and new possibilities. The Maryland air still carried that thick, humid embrace of late summer, but you could feel it, the familiar rhythm of another school year beginning to take hold. Hallways that had stood empty for months suddenly came alive again. The sharp slam of lockers. Friends calling out to each other, their voices bright with excitement from a summer spent apart. Nervous freshmen clutching their schedules, wide-eyed as they stepped into this bigger, more intimidating world. This was a place where anything could happen. Friendships would bloom, rivalries would spark, secrets would be whispered, and victories would be celebrated. For these students, this school was everything. Their own little universe, complete with unwritten rules, invisible hierarchies, and endless drama. Among them walked Warren Curtis Grant, just 15 years old, but already known by everyone in the best possible way. He had that rare quality, genuine kindness. People saw it in how he treated his friends, how he carried himself through the often brutal social maze of high school, with quiet confidence and that easy, welcoming smile. Warren was magnetic in the most natural way. Others just seemed to drift toward him, drawn to his steady presence in the chaotic whirlwind of teenage life. His family knew him as selfless, loving, a bright light that made everything better just by being there. At Japatown High, Warren Grant was simply a good kid, someone with his whole future spread out ahead of him like an open highway. Then, there was Jalen Rush, on Prince. At 16, he was the new face at Japatown. But his name wasn't new to law enforcement. When he walked through those school doors on September 6, 2024, it wasn't just his first day at a new school. It was another chapter in a deeply troubled story, one already thick with disciplinary files and police reports. His past read like a dark catalog of violence. Dozens of threats hurled at teachers, physical attacks on fellow students, a constant stream of verbal abuse that left fear and chaos wherever he went. Jalen was a young man wrapped in anger, someone who seemed to speak only in the language of violence. Later, a psychological evaluation would brand him as extremely high risk for future violence, a clinical, chilling snapshot of the storm building inside him. On that Friday, just the fourth day of the school year, these two boys found themselves on a collision course. Warren, radiating warmth and hope. Jalen, carrying nothing but rage. The spark that would ignite everything was as old as time itself. A girl. What started as typical teenage jealousy would spiral with terrifying speed into something final, something absolute. An act so devastating it would shatter the school's sense of safety forever, leaving an entire community drowning in grief and disbelief. The setting for this tragedy wasn't some dark alley or dangerous street corner. It was as ordinary as any place in the school, the boys' bathroom. The air inside felt electric with tension. Just a small tiled room like you'd find in any public building. But today, it had transformed into something else entirely. An arena. A small crowd of boys had already gathered, pulled in by that irresistible magnetism of brewing conflict. Cell phones were out, those dark little lenses ready to capture whatever was about to unfold for their digital audience. At the center of it all stood Warren Grant and Jalen Prince. The argument had followed them in from the hallways, a simmering dispute now reaching its boiling point. According to what Jalen would say later, Warren had started it, confronting him from behind about some girlfriend. But the grainy cell phone footage that would later become crucial evidence in the murder trial painted a completely different picture. The video showed Jalen moving forward, relentlessly closing the gap as Warren backed away, clearly trying to cool things down, desperately searching for some way out of this tightening trap. Jalen moved like a controlled storm. He was talking, his voice low but loaded with menace. His hand was broken at the time, an old injury that had required surgery months before. He would claim later that he'd told Warren, "My hand is broke. I ain't fighting nobody." But what the video actually captured was something far more chilling. As he stalked Warren across those cold tiles, he kept repeating the same dark promise, letting it hang in the air like poison. 4 times, his voice crystal clear on that recording, Jalen Prince looked directly at Warren Grant and said, "I will kill you." The other boys just watched, trapped witnesses to a real-life nightmare unfolding. This wasn't your typical schoolyard scuffle. The threat itself, the ice-cold way Jalen delivered it, it had changed everything. The very air seemed to crackle with a new and terrifying energy. Warren kept backing away, but he was running out of room, caught between Jalen's advancing fury and the unforgiving bathroom wall behind him. Then the unthinkable happened. Jalen slipped his backpack off his shoulder in one smooth, practiced motion. His hand disappeared inside, then emerged holding something that changed everything. The cold, flat black metal of a handgun. Witnesses would later recount the sequence of events with haunting precision. They watched as he pulled the gun from his bag. They saw him prepare the weapon, the metallic slide snapping back with a sound that sliced through the tense murmur of onlookers. For one suspended moment, everything stopped. The phone camera kept rolling. The entire world had collapsed into the space between these two boys, focused on the cold, merciless barrel of that gun. 53 seconds into the recording, you can hear the weapon being readied. 3 seconds later, a single thunderous crack shatters the confined space. Warren Grant collapsed to the floor. The bullet from the 9mm ghost gun Jalen had smuggled into school that day had struck him down. Pandemonium broke loose. The boys who moments before had been watching drama unfold were now witnesses to something far worse. They scattered like leaves in a storm, panic and adrenaline driving them from the bathroom into the hallway. Their cries and screams tore through the ordinary quiet of another school day. In all this chaos, Jalen Prince moved with unsettling calm. The hallway surveillance cameras caught everything as he emerged from the bathroom. He walked out with measured steps, appearing to slip something, presumably the gun, back into his backpack before disappearing into the flood of terrified students. He left Warren Grant bleeding on that bathroom floor and vanished from the school grounds. A 16-year-old boy who had just crossed a line he could never uncross, all on his very first day. What followed was a whirlwind of courage and catastrophe. As screams rang through the corridors and the school locked down, a group of Warren's friends charged back into that bathroom. They wouldn't abandon him there. They lifted him from that blood-stained floor and carried him out. A desperate, heroic attempt to save their friend's life. School nurses and Principal Melissa Williams were first to provide emergency care. No amount of training could have prepared them for treating a student with a gunshot wound in their own hallways. Law enforcement's response was swift and overwhelming. More than 100 officers converged on the school in Joppa, a quiet town about 35 miles northeast of Baltimore. A helicopter touched down in a nearby field, ready to rush Warren to a trauma center. It became a frantic race against time to save a life that was already slipping away. But the damage was too severe. Shortly after reaching the hospital, 15-year-old Warren Curtis Grant was pronounced dead. While doctors had fought to save Warren's life, a manhunt was already underway for his killer. Jalen Prince had fled the school and melted into the surrounding neighborhood. But this community, stunned and outraged by the violence that had invaded their school, offered him no refuge. Thanks to residents who spotted the fleeing teenager and called it in, sheriff's deputies captured him within minutes of the shooting. His brief and violent chapter as a student at Joppatown High was over. The gun, the instrument of this tragedy, was never recovered. He had ditched it somewhere between that bathroom and his arrest, a critical piece of evidence lost in the chaos of his escape. News of Warren's death and Jalen's arrest sent shockwaves of grief and fury through Harford County. A school, a place meant to be a safe haven for learning and growth, had become a crime scene. We're just devastated to be part of this terrible group of schools that have experienced tragedies like this, a shaken Harford County Public Schools. Superintendent Sean Bolson told the media. For Warren's family and friends, the news hit like a devastating blow, an unthinkable reality that would reshape their lives forever. His friends, struggling with this sudden violent loss, honored his memory the way young people do, getting tattoos to keep his spirit close, promising to make him proud. The boy they remembered as selfless, loving, kind, and loyal was gone. His life stolen by a senseless act of violence that made no sense at all. The trial of Jalen Prince began in May 2025. Charged as an adult, the 8-day proceedings laid bare every chilling detail in a Harford County courtroom. Prosecution, led by State's Attorney Allison M. Healy, methodically constructed their case for first-degree murder. They argued this wasn't some heat-of-the-moment explosion, but a calculated, deliberate, and premeditated killing. Their case stood on solid ground. The cell phone video capturing Jalen's repeated death threats, testimony from student witnesses who saw him ready the gun before firing, and his well-documented history of violence. Together, these painted the picture of a young man who had been building toward exactly this kind of act. The prosecution insisted that Jalen had walked into school that day with a loaded weapon, fully intending to use it. The defense painted a different picture, one of fear and tragic accident. Jalen Prince took the witness stand in his own defense, a risky move that put his credibility squarely before the jury. He took the stand and testified that Warren Grant was the aggressor. He'd been cornered, he said, and felt threatened. He told the court he had purchased the gun on the street to protect himself, a response to the trauma of having lost at least 5 friends to gun violence. He claimed he had only pulled the weapon to scare his classmates off, and that when Warren shook him, the gun had accidentally gone off. His mother also testified, adding a layer of familial desperation to the defense's case. The core of their argument came down to one word: intent. They claimed he never meant to kill Warren Grant, but the evidence was hard to refute. An expert testified that photos of the gun found on Jalen's phone matched the type of bullets recovered from Warren's body. And then there was the video, with its cold, clear recording of the death threats, playing over and over in the courtroom, a ghostly echo from the day of the tragedy. After about 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. They found Jalen Prince guilty of first-degree murder and 5 related firearms charges, including use of a firearm in the commission of a crime of violence and carrying a firearm on school property. As the verdict was read, Jalen showed little emotion, a blank mask that stood in stark contrast to the tearful reactions from both the gallery and even some members of the jury, who had been forced to bear witness to the tragic story of 2 young lives destroyed. The sentencing on October 14th, 2025, was the final act in this legal drama. The courtroom was filled with the crushing weight of grief. State's Attorney Allison M. Healy read 10 victim impact statements from Warren's family and friends. They spoke of the crushing emotional toll and the incomprehensible loss they had suffered. They painted a portrait of a young man who was the heart of their family, and they pleaded for accountability and justice. Gilly argued that Jalen Prince was not amendable to treatment and remained a serious risk to public safety. She introduced his extensive school records and 200 pages of records from the juvenile facility where he was held, which detailed continued assaultive behaviors and threats even after his conviction. Because of his age at the time of the crime, the state could not seek a sentence of life without parole. Instead, they asked for a sentence that would ensure he remained incarcerated for a significant portion of his life. Before handing down the sentence, the Honorable Judge Kevin Mahoney spoke of the profound and long-lasting effects of the tragedy. He noted that children should be able to go to school without fear of gun violence, stating that this should not be an acceptable reality. He concluded that there was no evidence that Jalen was under any threat from Warren, and that he had knowingly brought a loaded firearm to school with the intent to use it. Citing Jalen's long and significant history of violence, he sentenced him to life in prison, suspending all but 80 years. Because it was a crime of violence, Jalen Prince will not be eligible for parole until he has served at least half of his sentence, 40 years. In the end, there was no victory, only a profound and hollow sense of loss. As Allison M. Healy stated after the sentencing, no sentence will ever bring Warren back to his loved ones or make up for the fact that his life was cut short in the most tragic and senseless way. The case of Warren Grant is a story of a bright life extinguished and another loss to the cold calculus of the justice system. It stands as a stark reminder of how easily a school hallway can become a crime scene, and a testament to the fact that the most devastating storms are often the ones that rage unseen, just beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary day. Story 7. The air in this quiet town in northern Germany carried the familiar scent of the nearby Styr River and the distant, subtle hum of industry. For Lars Winmetank, born February 9, 1986, this was his entire world. This was where he'd grown up, made friends, found steady work at the local power plant, and built what anyone would call a perfectly ordinary life. At 28, Lars had become the kind of reliable presence you could count on. The type of man who visited his parents regularly, who stepped up without hesitation to help around their home after his father suffered a stroke. Those who knew him best would later describe him simply as normal, grounded in the routines and relationships that shaped his quiet corner of Schleswig-Holstein. But in late spring 2014, a ripple of excitement disturbed the calm surface of his life. His friends were planning something special, a week-long escape from the familiar to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea. They were bound for Golden Sands, Bulgaria, a resort town whose very name promised golden beaches and carefree fun. For Lars, who had never traveled outside Germany, this felt like a real adventure, a chance to break free from the predictable rhythm of his days. He agreed to join 5 of his friends for what should have been the perfect getaway. On June 30th, 2014, the group touched down in Varna, Bulgaria. The contrast hit them immediately, intoxicating and overwhelming. Golden Sands sprawled before them like a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of hotels, clubs, and sunseekers, all pressed against the sparkling coastline. Paul Romer, one of Lars's friends, would later remember that week with simple fondness. We relaxed on the beach, swam in the pool, played football, went clubbing, he'd say. Lars seemed completely at ease, relaxed, in a good mood, swept up in the effortless joy of vacation life. Yet, even in this paradise, something subtle began to shift. Tim Schultz, another friend, noticed Lars's eating habits seemed off. While the rest of them dove into the all-inclusive offerings, Lars seemed to survive on small bowls of soup or modest salads, his appetite strangely restrained. It was such a minor detail, a mere footnote in an otherwise carefree week. But looking back through the lens of what was to come, every small anomaly would be examined, magnified, questioned. The first 6 days melted together in a blur of sun, sand, and nightlife. Their trip was winding down, with the return flight scheduled for the morning of July 7th. On the evening of July 6th, their final night in Golden Sands, the friends headed out to a local bar. The atmosphere buzzed with energy, fueled by cheap beer, and that special kind of friendship that blooms in holiday resorts. It was here that the first real crack appeared in their perfect getaway. The conversation turned to football, a topic that can ignite fierce passion among German men. Lars was a devoted fan of SV Werder Bremen, his northern German club. But the men he found himself talking to supported FC Bayern Munich, that Bavarian powerhouse. What started as typical sports banter, the kind of club rivalry you'd expect, quickly escalated into something heated and tense. The exact details of what happened next remain frustratingly unclear, lost in the noise of the bar and the fog of memory. But the argument grew intense enough that Lars eventually walked away from his friends outside a restaurant, disappearing alone into the Bulgarian night. His friends wouldn't see him again until morning, and when Lars finally reappeared at the resort, everything had changed. He told them a story that was both confusing and deeply alarming. He'd been attacked, but the details kept shifting. Some friends remembered him saying the same Bayern Munich fans from the bar had beaten him up. Others recalled a more sinister version, that those men had actually hired 4 locals to ambush him. Whatever the true sequence of events, the physical evidence couldn't be denied. Lars had sustained a painful jaw injury, and more seriously, a ruptured eardrum. Their idyllic holiday had ended in violence. His friends immediately sprang into action, accompanying him to a local doctor who confirmed their worst fears. The diagnosis was clear, and it changed everything. Flying was absolutely out of the question. The cabin pressure could cause serious, permanent damage to his perforated eardrum. The doctor prescribed ciprofloxacin, a 500 mg antibiotic to prevent infection, and strongly advised delaying any travel by air. His friends offered to stay. They wouldn't abandon him in a foreign country, injured and shaken. But Lars insisted he was fine, that he could handle things on his own. He practically pushed them to stick with their original plan and fly home as scheduled. Reluctantly, they agreed. On July 7th, they checked out of the resort and headed to Varna Airport, leaving their friend behind to deal with the aftermath of a vacation gone terribly wrong. Lars checked out at the same time as his friends, but instead of heading home, he began searching for somewhere new to stay. He found the Hotel Color Varna, a budget-friendly place conveniently tucked near the airport. He checked in for just one night, planning to rest up and reschedule his flight home once the doctor gave him the all-clear. But alone in that anonymous hotel room, cut off from the familiar comfort of his friends, Lars's state of mind began to unravel at an alarming pace. The carefree vacationer had vanished, replaced by a man consumed by a growing, inexplicable paranoia. His behavior turned erratic, shadowed by a fear that seemed to emerge from thin air. The hotel's CCTV cameras, those silent, unblinking watchers, caught glimpses of his distress. The footage reveals him pacing the corridors, peering nervously through windows, as though searching for some unseen threat. At one point, strangely enough, he's seen hiding inside an elevator. Sometime during that endless, solitary night, he placed a phone call. It was to his mother, Sandra Mitank, back in Germany. But this wasn't an ordinary call. His voice came through in frantic whispers, trembling with a terror she couldn't begin to understand. 4 men were after him, he told her. They are trying to kill or rob me, he whispered across the distance, his panic reaching through even that strained connection. He begged her to cancel his credit cards right away. He also sent her a text, asking about the medication the doctor had given him. Then, sometime after 10 a.m., he suddenly left the hotel, disappearing into the darkness for more than an hour. Where he went, what he did during that time, it remains a complete mystery. When he finally returned, his agitation hadn't eased one bit. The next morning, July 8th, he called his mother again. The people hunting him were getting closer, he warned her. Despite his obvious terror, Lars knew he had to get home. That morning, he made his way to Varna Airport, the final, fateful stage of his journey. He even texted his mother to let her know he'd reached the terminal. His plan seemed simple enough. See the airport doctor, get medical clearance, and catch the next flight to Germany. He walked into the medical office and met with Dr. Kostov. The doctor would later recall Lars as nervous and scattered, nothing like your typical tourist. He seemed jumpy, constantly on edge. Dr. Kostov examined his ear and, finding nothing concerning, told him he was cleared to fly home. But the reassurance didn't calm Lars at all. If anything, he grew more agitated, voicing concerns about the antibiotic he'd been prescribed. He lingered in the office, his anxiety filling the small room like a heavy fog. The airport was under renovation at the time, with construction noise humming constantly in the background. Into this already tense atmosphere, a construction worker stepped into the medical office. The man's sudden appearance seemed to shatter what little composure Lars had left. His eyes went wide with panic, and he began shaking uncontrollably. He leaped to his feet and cried out, his voice raw with pure terror. I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here. Before Dr. Kostov or the worker could even react, Lars bolted from the room. He fled the office, leaving everything scattered on the floor behind him. His wallet, his phone, his passport, the backpack containing all his belongings, everything abandoned in his desperate escape. Airport security cameras captured what happened next. The footage, later viewed by millions worldwide, is grainy and silent, and deeply unsettling. It shows a young man in a simple t-shirt and shorts, sprinting through the terminal with the desperation of someone running for his very life. He never looks back. He just runs. He bursts through the main entrance into the bright Bulgarian sunlight. Without missing a step, he races across the forecourt, past waiting taxis and milling travelers. His target: a towering barbed wire fence separating the airport from the countryside beyond. He reaches that formidable barrier and, fueled by pure adrenaline, scrambles over it. Landing on the other side, he finds himself in a vast meadow at that time of year, a field of towering sunflowers. He plunges into the dense growth, his figure growing smaller and smaller in that sea of yellow and green, until finally he vanishes from the camera's view completely. That was the last time anyone ever saw Lars Mittank. The aftermath unleashed a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and questions that would never find answers. When Lars failed to return home, his family's worry transformed into something much darker. His mother, Sandra, haunted by those terrifying phone calls, knew immediately that something was horribly wrong. She launched a relentless search for her son, a quest for answers that would consume her entire life. The Bulgarian authorities opened an investigation, but they had precious little to work with. A man had simply vanished in broad daylight at an international airport. Yet no one witnessed what happened after he disappeared into that forest. They searched the area thoroughly, but the vast, dense landscape revealed nothing at all. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him whole. Sandra Mittank hired a private investigator, Andreas Gudig, who carefully searched through Bulgarian hospital records, looking for unidentified patients, hoping to find a man who might have lost his memory. The search led nowhere. With no official answers to hold on to, wild speculation rushed in to fill the emptiness. Countless theories emerged, from the reasonable to the completely far-fetched, each one trying to make sense of Lars's strange behavior and his mysterious disappearance. One of the most compelling theories focused on the antibiotic Cefroil. German and Bulgarian doctors, along with Sandra Mittank herself, wondered if Lars had suffered a rare but severe reaction to the medication. Some antibiotics can trigger frightening symptoms, hallucinations, crushing paranoia, overwhelming anxiety. This would perfectly explain those whispered, terrified phone calls and his panicked flight from the airport. But there was a problem with this theory. Dr. Toff, the airport physician, later made a startling claim. Lars had never actually taken the medication at all. He didn't even fill his prescription, Toff insisted, which left him completely baffled by Lars's terrified state. If it wasn't the medication, then what could it have been? Mental health experts, like Dr. Todd Grande, suggested another possibility. Lars might have experienced what's called a first-break psychosis, the sudden, devastating onset of a mental illness like schizophrenia, potentially triggered by the stress and trauma of the assault. But there's an even more chilling theory. What if Lars's paranoia wasn't a delusion at all? What if he really was in danger? The bar fight, the brutal beating that followed. Could these have been connected to something far more serious than a simple football rivalry? Online investigators have long suspected that the men he fought with were still hunting him, and that his desperate escape from the airport was a genuine attempt to flee a very real threat. This would certainly explain his terror, but it raises darker questions. If they were pursuing him, did they catch him in that forest? And if so, why was no body ever found? Some have whispered about deeper criminal connections, perhaps drug trafficking. That might explain such a professional, clean disappearance. But no evidence has ever surfaced to support this theory. Then there's the possibility that breaks Sandra's heart with both hope and anguish. That Lars is still alive somewhere, lost and unaware of who he really is. Perhaps amnesia from his head injury, or a complete psychological break, left him wandering, homeless, and forgotten. This is the hope his mother Sandra clings to with fierce determination. She believes he's out there somewhere, lost and desperately needing her help. Over the years, this fragile hope has flickered to life with reported sightings. Shortly after he vanished, a truck driver in Varna claimed he'd seen a hitchhiker who looked just like Lars. Years later, in 2019, another truck driver in Germany swore he'd given a ride to a man from Dresden, someone who resembled an older Lars with long hair, a beard, and eyes that looked tired and hollow. But each lead has ultimately gone cold, leading back to the same crushing uncertainty. In the years since he disappeared, the case of Lars Mittank has taken on a life of its own. What began as a personal family tragedy has transformed into a global internet phenomenon. Yet despite all the worldwide attention, the private investigators, and his mother's tireless efforts, the mystery remains as deep and impenetrable as it was on that scorching July day in 2014. The truth of what happened to Lars Mittank seems locked away in the very forest he ran into, somewhere beyond that field of sunflowers. Was he running from real enemies, or from the terrifying phantoms of his own fractured mind? Did he meet a terrible fate in those woods, or did he somehow escape, only to lose himself in a completely different way? For his family, and especially for his mother, the absence of answers is its own special kind of torment. There's a good chance he'll come back, Sandra has said, her hope burning like a defiant flame against the gathering darkness of the passing years. He just needs my help. Her search continues, a powerful testament to a mother's unbreakable love in the face of an incomprehensible void. The story of Lars Mittank isn't just a mystery. It's a tragedy of a life suddenly interrupted. A story that doesn't end with a period, but with a haunting, unanswered question mark, suspended forever in that grainy security footage of a young man running, until he simply vanished from sight. Story 8. The San Francisco fog crept through the streets of Diamond Heights like a ghostly visitor on Saturday evening, May 16, 1998. It wrapped itself around the sleek lines of the condominium complex, where Lisa Valdez lived, softening the city's distant hum to a gentle murmur. But inside her studio apartment, the world was anything but quiet. It pulsed with warmth, vibrant energy, and the kind of easy laughter that seemed to follow Lisa wherever she went. At 36, Lisa was pure dynamism. A woman her loved ones described as a ball of energy. She thrived as a software analyst in the booming tech world, sharp and successful. But her true essence wasn't found in lines of code. It lived in her unwavering loyalty, her fierce devotion to friends and family. Her best friend since age 15, Misa Robinson, understood this better than anyone. Their names rhymed, a small coincidence they believed was destiny calling. To Mesa, Lisa embodied ride or die before that phrase ever existed. When Lisa was your friend, she was your friend completely. A constant, brilliant light in your world. That Saturday night, her light shone on a small dinner party she was hosting. The guest of honor was her mother's boyfriend. A comfortable gathering in the cozy but perpetually cluttered space she called home. The apartment reflected Lisa perfectly. Full of life, maybe a little chaotic. The main room featured a Murphy bed, a practical studio solution, currently folded away to make room for guests. Laughter filled the air as the evening unfolded. A simple, joyful night that held no hint of approaching darkness. Around midnight, the party wound down. Guests departed into the misty night, leaving Lisa alone in her warm apartment, surrounded by the pleasant remnants of the evening. It was the last time anyone close to her would see her alive. 4 days passed. The vibrant energy that defined Lisa Valdez seemed to have vanished from the world. Calls went unanswered. Friends grew worried. Inside the condominium building, a different, more sinister presence began announcing itself. A foul, clawing odor seeped from beneath Lisa's apartment door, disturbing the hallway's sterile quiet. It was the unmistakable smell of decay, death's grim announcement that prompted a police call on Wednesday, May 20th, 1998. The responding officers found the door unlocked. The moment they stepped inside, oppressive heat hit them like a wall. Someone had cranked the thermostat to 80 degrees, accelerating the process that created that terrible smell. The television flickered silently, casting eerie light across the scene. The apartment showed its usual clutter, but this was different chaos entirely. The Murphy bed was pulled down but knocked partially off its stand. On the floor lay Lisa Valdez. Her body showed advanced decomposition. Her shirt was pulled over her head. The scene spoke of violence and violation. Blood stained everything: the bed, mattress, sheets. For retired San Francisco Police Inspector Roman Schultz, it became an image seared forever into his memory. The ball of energy, the ride-or-die friend, the brilliant light in so many lives, had been brutally extinguished. The first hours of any murder investigation become a frantic race against time, a desperate scramble to capture fleeting evidence and fading memories before they vanish forever. In Lisa Valdez's case, investigators entering her small, overheated apartment already faced a disadvantage. 4 days had passed since her death, allowing the scene to degrade. Heat had accelerated decomposition, blurring timelines and obscuring potential clues. The medical examiner's report revealed a brutal picture. Lisa had been stabbed 21 times. The wounds concentrated on her face, jaw, chin, neck, and chest. A frenzy of violence that screamed of rage. Defensive wounds on her hands proved she'd fought for her life. 3 stab wounds had penetrated major blood vessels, causing rapid, catastrophic blood loss. Death would have come within seconds or minutes. But advanced decomposition prevented the examiner from pinpointing exact time of death. They couldn't determine if inappropriate contact had occurred, though her body's positioning and partially undressed state strongly suggested it. Crime scene investigators worked with painstaking care, collecting numerous items from the cluttered apartment. Every stained fabric piece, every potential evidence fragment was carefully bagged and labeled. They gathered bloody bed sheets, several bloody pillows, and torn undergarments, all bearing witness to the struggle that had unfolded. From the bathroom, they retrieved 2 small but potentially crucial items: a pair of Band-Aids found floating in the toilet bowl. The toilet seat was raised, and investigators lifted a partial fingerprint from its underside. Blood streaks painted Lisa's door and spilled onto her neighbor's door, each one carefully swabbed for analysis. Lisa's keys and her black gym bag had vanished. These were the only items that seemed to be missing. No signs of ransacking anywhere. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was deeply personal. Detective Pamela Hofsass of the SFPD took charge of the investigation. She and her team dove into the painstaking work of piecing together Lisa's final days, starting with the people closest to her. They traced back to the dinner party, building a timeline that wrapped up around midnight on Saturday. But between that moment and the discovery of her body lay a haunting 4-day void. The investigation naturally shifted toward Lisa's romantic life. Could there be a jealous ex-boyfriend? A spurned lover? Friends revealed to police that Lisa had planned a date for the day after she was killed, with a man named Albert Coe. Coe had apparently canceled before her death, but his name immediately landed him on the suspect list. He came in for questioning and fully cooperated with police, but the lead fizzled out. The breakthrough, however, came from the lab. As forensic scientists examined the blood evidence from the scene, they discovered something that transformed this case from hopeless to promising. While most of the blood belonged to Lisa, they found droplets on her pillows that told a different story. It was the blood of an unknown male. The killer had left a piece of himself behind. He'd likely been injured during the struggle, perhaps by the same knife he used to take Lisa's life, or by Lisa herself as she fought back. Now investigators possessed the two most powerful weapons in law enforcement: the killer's fingerprints and his DNA. With this physical evidence in hand, police had a clear path forward, though a daunting one. They had to find the man whose blood stained Lisa's pillow. They began collecting DNA samples from the men in Lisa's life, including Albert Coe, hoping for the match that would crack the case wide open. But one by one, the results returned negative. The DNA profile from the crime scene matched no one they'd tested. As weeks melted into months, the investigation hit a wall. The trail went cold. The partial fingerprint from the toilet seat yielded no matches in existing databases. The audio cassette from Lisa's answering machine offered no fresh leads. A crucial piece of evidence, Lisa's computer, which might have held emails or other clues about her relationships, was somehow lost or never preserved by police. An oversight that would later face intense scrutiny. The identity of the man who had bled in her apartment remained a complete mystery. He was a ghost, a phantom with no name and no face. His only signature, the microscopic cells he'd left behind in a moment of brutal violence. For Lisa's friends and family, the lack of answers became an agony layered on top of their grief. For Detective Hofsass, it was a puzzle she refused to abandon. The file for Lisa Valdez would stay on her desk, a constant, silent promise that justice hadn't been forgotten. It had only been delayed. Years bled into one another, each adding a fresh layer of dust to the cold case file of Lisa Valdez. The vibrant memory of the woman who was a ride-or-die friend remained painfully fresh for Misa Robinson. But for the world, the story faded. Misa felt as though the world should have stopped turning on May 20th, 1998. But it kept spinning, leaving her and Lisa's other loved ones in private darkness. The case joined San Francisco's growing list of unsolved cases. A tragic story that would occasionally surface in newspaper retrospectives before sinking back into obscurity. But in a quiet corner of the San Francisco Police Department, the case never truly went dormant. Detective Pamela Hofsass held on to it, a quiet guardian of a promise made to a victim she'd never met. She'd learned from colleagues about the kind of person Lisa was: outgoing, loving, a joy to be around. The sheer senselessness of the crime, the violent end to such a bright life, fueled a determination that time couldn't erode. Every single year, as forensic technology crept forward with new leaps in sensitivity and precision, Hofsass would resubmit the evidence from Lisa's apartment. The blood of the unknown male, preserved and waiting, remained her primary focus. She sent the DNA profile to be run against state and national databases, a ritual of hope against dwindling odds. For years, the answer stayed the same: no match. Meanwhile, a man named Anthony Quinn Hughes was living a life of petty crime and instability. In the years following Lisa's death, his name appeared on police blotters for burglaries and thefts. He drifted through the city's underbelly, a transient figure whose path of low-level criminality seemed completely disconnected from the brutal slaying in Diamond Heights. In a frustrating twist of fate, Hughes's name had actually been sitting in Lisa's address book and on her caller ID records back in 1998. A lead that had been tragically overlooked during the initial chaotic investigation. In 2002, he was convicted of an unrelated burglary, a crime that should have triggered mandatory DNA collection under California law. But through another crack in the system, his sample was never taken or processed. The ghost from Lisa's apartment remained nameless. His DNA, a key without a lock. For 13 long years, this became the status quo. 13 years of Misa Robinson's grief. 13 years of a family's unanswered questions. 13 years of Detective Hofsass's patient, dogged persistence. To Robinson, the detective was an angel in a blue suit, a beacon of hope cutting through the suffocating darkness of a cold case. Then in 2011, everything changed. Advances in DNA technology and the expansion of criminal databases had finally caught up with the ghost. A routine check, one of many that Hofsass had initiated over the years, returned a hit. The DNA profile from the blood on Lisa Valdez's pillow, the blood of her killer, matched a profile in the system. The profile belonged to a 52-year-old man named Anthony Quinn Hughes. He had finally been compelled to provide a DNA sample following another conviction, and the key had found its lock. After 13 years, the Phantom had a name. The discovery sent shockwaves through the SFPD. The cold case was instantly hot. The name Anthony Quinn Hughes was cross-referenced with the original case file and that overlooked clue from 1998. His name in Lisa's address book suddenly blazed with significance. Investigators quickly pieced together his criminal history spanning all the years he had remained free. On September 10th, 2011, they located him in the heart of the Tenderloin, one of San Francisco's grittiest neighborhoods. The arrest was just the beginning. The true drama would unfold in the sterile confines of an interrogation room. Hughes was brought in for questioning. He was now a man in his early 50s, his face hardened by years of rough living. He sat across from the detectives, his demeanor sullen and uncooperative. The detectives began their questioning, circling around the events of May 1998, a lifetime ago. Hughes denied everything. He claimed not to know Lisa Valdez, claimed never to have been in her apartment. Then the detectives played their ace. They told him about the blood. They told him that his DNA, and his alone, was found at the scene of a brutal murder that took place 13 years prior. DNA from you was found in Lisa's apartment from 1998, they stated, the words hanging in the air with irrefutable weight. What happened next stunned even the seasoned investigators in the room. As the reality of the evidence cornered him, Hughes did not confess. He did not break down in tears or shout in denial. Instead, in a shocking and desperate act of self-destruction, he grabbed the pen he had been given and wounded himself with it. It was a bizarre, violent act, a confession written not in words, but in his own actions, mirroring the violence he had inflicted upon Lisa Valdez more than a decade earlier. The ghost had been unmasked, and in doing so, he had tried to erase himself. But it was too late. Justice, patient and relentless, had finally caught him. The trial of Anthony Quinn Hughes began in San Francisco, bringing the 15-year-old case back into the public eye. For Lisa's friends and family, it was the painful but necessary final chapter. Misa Robinson was there, her presence a testament to a friendship that death could not sever. She sat in the courtroom, sharing an embrace with Detective Pamela Hofsass, the woman she credited with keeping the hope of justice alive. The prosecution, led by the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, built its case on the unshakable foundation of DNA evidence. The blood on the pillows in Lisa Valdez's apartment belonged to Anthony Quinn Hughes. This was the central damning fact from which there was no escape. Prosecutors argued that Hughes had gone to Lisa's apartment with criminal intent, and when she fought back, he had brutally murdered her. They charged him with first-degree murder and attempted rape. Hughes's defense team, facing a mountain of forensic evidence, focused their strategy on the one thing they had in their favor: the passage of time. They filed a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that the 13-year delay in charging Hughes had irreparably damaged his ability to defend himself. Hughes, they claimed, could not remember his activities. On the weekend, Lisa was killed. And neither could his ex-wife, who might have provided an alibi. Key witnesses' memories had faded. Lisa's housekeeper's recollection of a male voice she might have heard was now hazy. Lisa's friend's memory about who might have been visiting her late that night had become unreliable. Furthermore, they pointed to the mistakes of the initial investigation. The police had failed to preserve Lisa's computer and the answering machine audio tape had died out. They had negligently failed to contact Hughes in 1998, even though his name was in her address book. and they had failed to obtain his DNA in 2002 after his burglary conviction. This delay, they argued, wasn't just unfortunate. It was a clear violation of his right to a fair trial. The trial court denied the motion, but left the door open for the issue to surface again later. The defense team wasn't done fighting. They attempted to point the finger elsewhere, raising what's known as third-party culpability. Their focus turned to a friend of Lisa's, someone whose unrequited love, they claimed, gave him motive for this terrible crime. They pushed to introduce hearsay evidence suggesting this friend had been planning to visit Lisa's apartment right around the time of the murder. But the judge shut it down, ruling the evidence inadmissible, finding it insufficiently incriminating and built on untrustworthy second-hand information. The jury was left to weigh two very different arguments. On one side stood the defense, highlighting how much time had passed and how memories fade. On the other sat the prosecution, armed with irrefutable scientific proof. The killer's blood left at the scene, a perfect match to Anthony Quinn Hughes. After deliberating, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Anthony Quinn Hughes guilty of murdering Lisa Valdez. But the legal process wasn't quite finished. On the charge of attempted assault, the jury couldn't reach unanimous agreement, and a mistrial was declared on that count. When sentencing time arrived, the judge made a significant decision. While the jury had convicted Hughes of first-degree murder, which requires proof of premeditation and deliberation, the judge reduced the conviction to second-degree murder. In the judge's view, the prosecution hadn't presented enough evidence to prove the murder was planned in advance. It was a brutal, horrific crime, but legally, it was deemed to have been committed without premeditation. Finally, nearly 2 decades after Lisa Valdez drew her last breath, her killer faced sentencing. Anthony Quinn Hughes received 16 years to life in prison. He was sent to the California healthcare facility in Stockton to serve his time. To the very end, he maintained his innocence, claiming he'd been wrongly accused. For Misa Robinson, the sentence brought a sense of closure, though it could never fill the void Lisa left behind. That light was extinguished in such a violent way that truly, I fell into darkness, she remembered. The conviction was confirmation that Lisa's life mattered, that she hadn't been forgotten. It was a victory for the quiet, relentless police work of Detective Hofsas and her team. Robinson hoped her friend's story would remind people that even amid tensions between the public and police, there are angels walking around in blue suits. The case of Lisa Valdez tells a story of sharp contrasts. It's the story of a vibrant life cut short by brutal, senseless violence. It's the story of a cold case frozen in time by lack of evidence, and the story of a breakthrough thawed by the heat of scientific advancement. It's a story of investigative failures and of one detective's unwavering persistence. But most of all, it's a deeply human story about the enduring power of friendship, the hollowing pain of loss, and the slow, grinding but ultimately triumphant path of justice. Lisa Valdez, that ball of energy, was silenced in 1998, but the echo of her life and the fight for her memory ultimately brought her killer out of the shadows and into the light of accountability. Story 9. The heat in Orlando, Florida isn't just weather, it's a living thing. During summer months, it settles like a heavy weight over the manicured lawns and sun-bleached asphalt of suburban neighborhoods. A thick, suffocating presence that whispers promises of afternoon thunderstorms that rarely bring the relief they seem to offer. It was in this stifling summer air of 28 that a story began to unfold. A story that would grip the entire nation with an almost feverish intensity. The tale of a bright-eyed 2-year-old girl with a radiant smile and warm brown eyes, and of her mother, whose web of deception would become more notorious than the very crime she stood accused of. The Anthony family made their home on Hope Spring Drive, in a tidy 2-story house that painted the perfect picture of middle-class serenity from the street. George Anthony, a former police officer, served as the family's steadfast patriarch. a man of rough-edged warmth and old-fashioned principles. His wife, Cindy, worked as a nurse, becoming the family's emotional heartbeat, a devoted woman whose universe centered on her work and, most importantly, her precious granddaughter. Their son Lee had grown up and moved on to his own life, but their daughter Casey remained at home. At 22, Casey found herself suspended between two very different worlds. She was mother to the spirited Kaylee Marie Anthony, yet she ached for the freedom and spontaneity that came naturally to other young women her age. A world filled with friends, late-night adventures, and romantic possibilities. The kind of life that motherhood seemed to have placed just beyond her reach. Little Kaylee had become the bright center around which the entire Anthony household revolved. To her doting grandparents, she represented a beautiful second chance at parenthood, a fountain of pure, uncomplicated happiness. But to her mother, Kaylee meant something far more complicated. Casey clearly adored her daughter. That much shone through in the countless photographs and home videos she captured. Yet beneath that love lived a restless energy, a growing gap between the life she was living and the one she desperately longed for. She had work, she explained to her parents, an exciting position as an event planner at Universal Studios. The job demanded late nights and frequent out-of-town travel. It was a perfectly crafted story, just one thread in the elaborate fiction she wove to carve out space for her secret life. A life her parents knew almost nothing about. On June 16, 2008, what started as an ordinary morning would mark an extraordinary turning point. Casey walked out of the Hope Spring Drive house with little Kaylee by her side. She told her parents she was dropping Kaylee off with the babysitter, a woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, Zanny for short, before heading to work. George Anthony watched them leave together. It would be the last time he ever saw his granddaughter alive. What came next wasn't the immediate, sharp-edged panic you'd expect when a child vanishes. Instead, it was a slow-building sense of dread that stretched across 31 agonizing days. For an entire month, Casey lived a double life with breathtaking boldness. While her parents believed Kaylee was safe and sound with her nanny, Casey was out painting the town. She danced at nightclubs, entered hot body contests, went shopping, and spent intimate time with her new boyfriend, Tony Lazaro. She was finally living the unrestrained life she'd always wanted. During this time, she added fresh ink to her right shoulder, a new tattoo bearing two Italian words that would later become a lightning rod for public outrage. Bella Vita, beautiful life. Meanwhile, Cindy's phone calls and text messages grew more frequent and more urgent. Where was Kaylee? Why couldn't she speak with her granddaughter? But Casey, a masterful and prolific storyteller, had a ready answer for every question. Zanny had taken Kaylee out of town. They were enjoying a beach vacation in Tampa. Kaylee was having a blast at a theme park. Each excuse sounded reasonable enough to keep Cindy's darkest fears from taking root, but a constant thread of anxiety hummed beneath the surface. The first concrete sign that something had gone terribly wrong didn't come from Casey. It came from a tow yard. On June 27th, residents at a local apartment complex had grown tired of complaining about a car that had been sitting abandoned for days. On June 30th, Casey Anthony's white Pontiac Sunfire was finally towed to an impound lot. On July 15th, the Anthony family received an official notice. Cindy and George, now consumed with worry after weeks of Casey's slippery explanations, knew they had to track her down. They found her at a friend's apartment, and when they confronted her, the carefully constructed wall of lies finally crumbled. Through tears, Casey made a shocking confession. Kaylee was gone. She hadn't laid eyes on her daughter in an entire month. Zenaida, the nanny she'd spoken of so often, had kidnapped a little girl. George drove straight to the tow yard to retrieve the abandoned car. The moment the lot manager pulled open the door, a horrific stench hit him like a physical assault. It was an odor he recognized all too well from his days in law enforcement. A smell that, once experienced, can never be forgotten or mistaken for anything else. It was the unmistakable scent of death. "I smelled a dead body," he would later testify, his voice weighted down by the terrible memory. Inside the trunk, they discovered a bag of garbage, but that sickening odor lingered, thick and nauseating, seeming to cling to every fiber of the carpet. That very same day, July 15th, 2008, Cindy Anthony picked up her phone and made the call that would spark a media wildfire. Her voice cracked with a raw mixture of terror and rage. "I have someone here that I need to have arrested," she told the 911 dispatcher, speaking about Casey. Then came the words that would echo through years of investigation and courtroom drama. "I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." 31 days after Caylee Anthony was last seen alive, she was finally reported missing. The investigation began, and with it came the complete unraveling of Casey Anthony's elaborate world of fiction. Detectives brought her in for questioning, and with an almost eerie calmness, she spun her tale of a devoted nanny who had simply vanished with her child. She confidently led detectives to the apartment complex where she claims Zenaida lived. But they discovered something troubling. The apartment had been vacant for months. The Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez she named didn't exist, but she had never met Casey or Caylee Anthony. Next, she took them to Universal Studios, her supposed workplace. She swiped her card with complete confidence, led them on a winding walk through the bustling theme park, and then, with a casual shrug, admitted the truth. She didn't work there anymore. She had been fired years ago. Lie after lie crumbled under the slightest scrutiny, but on one point she remained absolutely unshakable. Caylee was alive, taken by a phantom nanny, and she had no idea where her daughter was. The more she lied, the more suspicion gathered around her like storm clouds. On July 16th, she was arrested, not for murder, but for child neglect and providing false statements to law enforcement. The search for Caylee Anthony began in earnest, a desperate nationwide effort fueled by round-the-clock media coverage and the flickering hope of a miracle. Volunteers scoured the swamps and dense woods of central Florida. Psychics offered cryptic clues. The face of the missing toddler was everywhere, a cherubic, smiling ghost, haunting the national consciousness. While the public searched, forensic investigators began their own painstaking work. They focused on the Pontiac Sunfire, the source of that foul, unforgettable odor. A cadaver dog, specially trained to detect the specific chemical compounds of human decomposition, gave a positive alert on the trunk. Another dog alerted in the backyard of the Anthony home. Scientists from the FBI and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee were called in. Dr. Arpad Vass, a specialist in the chemistry of decomposition, analyzed air samples taken from the trunk. He found high levels of chloroform, a chemical that can render someone unconscious, and dozens of other compounds consistent with a decomposing human body. In the trunk liner, they found a single strand of hair. Under a powerful microscope, it revealed a dark, distinctive band near the root. According to the FBI expert, this phenomenon only occurred in hairs from a decomposing body. DNA testing confirmed it was a mitochondrial match to Casey and Caylee Anthony. On the family's home computer, forensic analysts recovered deleted search histories. In the days before Caylee's disappearance, someone had searched for chloroform, neck breaking, and household weapons. A more chilling search discovered years later was made on the very day Caylee was last seen alive. Foolproof suffocation. As the forensic evidence mounted, the web of lies continued. In taped jailhouse conversations with her parents, Casey was a master of manipulation. She played the victim, expressed frustration that police weren't focusing on finding her daughter, all while revealing nothing. On October 14, 2008, she was indicted by a grand jury on charges of first-degree murder. She pleaded not guilty. The state of Florida announced it would seek the death penalty. For 5 agonizing months, the search for Caylee continued, a public performance of hope against a backdrop of increasingly grim evidence. Then, on December 11th, 2008, a meter reader named Roy Kronk was walking through a wooded, swampy area less than half a mile from the Anthony family home. He had called police about a suspicious bag in the area months earlier, but nothing had come of it. This time, he looked closer. He nudged a black trash bag with his stick and saw something white inside. It was a small, human skull. Police descended on the scene. They found the scattered skeletal remains of a small child. The skull had duct tape wrapped around the mouth and nose area. A Winnie the Pooh blanket, one Kaylee was known to love, was found with the bones, all stuffed inside a laundry bag. On December 19th, dental records confirmed the unthinkable. It was Kaylee. The cause of death was listed as homicide by undetermined means. The search was over. The battle was about to begin. The trial of Casey Anthony began on May 24th, 2011. It was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national spectacle. The jury was selected from another county and sequestered, shielded from the relentless media storm that had already convicted Casey in the court of public opinion. The prosecution, led by state attorneys Linda Drain Burdick and Jeff Ashton, laid out their case in opening statements. Their narrative was simple and damning. Casey Anthony was a party girl who saw her 2-year-old daughter not as a blessing, but as an obstacle to the life of freedom she craved. On June 16, 2008, they argued, she used chloroform to render Kaylee unconscious, then placed duct tape over her nose and mouth. She drove around with the body in the trunk of her car for days, before dumping it in the woods like a piece of trash. No one makes an accident look like murder, Ashton declared. His words struck like a lightning bolt, a direct challenge to the defense. Then, it was the defense's turn. Jose Baez, Casey's lead attorney, a charismatic and then unknown lawyer, rose before the jury and dropped a bombshell that sent shockwaves rippling through the courtroom. Kaylee's death, he declared, was a tragic accident. On June 16, 2008, she had drowned in the family's above-ground swimming pool. Her grandfather, George Anthony, was the first to discover her lifeless body. Consumed by panic, he had convinced Casey that she would be blamed for child neglect and spend the rest of her life behind bars. George had disposed of the body and forced Casey into a month-long web of lies to cover it up. But Baez wasn't finished. He offered a chilling explanation for Casey's pathological lying, for her bizarrely emotionless behavior in the face of tragedy. He alleged that for years, since she was just a child, Casey had endured inappropriate treatment at the hands of her father, George Anthony. Her brother Lee was also implicated in this dark family secret. This trauma, Baez argued, had taught her to disconnect from reality, to retreat into a world of denial and fabricated truths. It was the only way she knew how to survive. George Anthony, sitting in the courtroom, shook his head in disbelief, his face a mask of anguish and rage. The trial unfolded over 6 grueling weeks, a parade of 400 pieces of evidence and nearly 100 witnesses. The prosecution built their case brick by circumstantial brick. They presented the forensic evidence with methodical precision. The unmistakable smell of death in the car. The chloroform detected in air samples. The single hair bearing the telltale signs of decomposition. The damning computer searches. They called witnesses who testified to Casey's partying and carefree demeanor during the 31 days. Her daughter was missing. They played the frantic 911 call from Cindy, her voice cracking with desperation. They put George Anthony on the stand, where he tearfully denied the horrific allegations and any involvement in a cover-up. Baez and his defense team were relentless in dismantling the prosecution's case. They aimed to create reasonable doubt, and they found fertile ground. The forensic evidence, they argued, was nothing more than fantasy science. Dr. Vass's air sample analysis had never been used in a criminal trial before. Its reliability was questionable at best. The hair analysis relied on a new, not yet peer-reviewed study. The amount of chloroform found was minuscule. There was no DNA on the duct tape. Piece by piece, they chipped away at the credibility of witnesses. They brought up Roy Cronk's inconsistent statements about when and how he found the body, suggesting he may have been involved somehow. They put Cindy Anthony on the stand, and in a stunning moment, she testified that she was the one who had been searching for chloroform on the family computer. She claimed she had been looking up information on chlorophyll for her plants. The prosecution showed work records indicating she was at her job during the time of those searches, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The trial became a masterclass in legal theater. The prosecution painted Casey as a monster, a lying, callous individual, as Baye would later characterize their strategy. The defense presented her as a victim, a traumatized young woman who had suffered a terrible accident and was now being railroaded by an overzealous prosecution and a public hungry for a villain. Casey Anthony herself never took the stand. She sat at the defense table day after day, her expression often unreadable, a blank canvas onto which millions projected their own theories of her guilt or innocence. Closing arguments began on July 3rd. Jeff Ashton for the prosecution once again walked the jury through those 31 days of deception, painting them as the unmistakable actions of a guilty conscience. Responses to grief are as varied as the day is long, prosecutor Linda Drain, Burdick, argued in her rebuttal. But responses to guilt are so predictable. What do guilty people do? They lie. They avoid. They run. She ended with a powerful side-by-side image, a photo of Casey partying in a nightclub, and a photo of the Bella Vita tattoo she got while her daughter was missing. Jose Baez, in his closing, hammered home the central theme of his defense. The state had not met its burden of proof. The strategy behind that is, if you hate her, then you'll start to look at this evidence in a different light, he told the jury, urging them to look past their emotional reactions and focus on the gaps in the evidence. There was no definitive cause of death. There was no DNA linking Casey to the crime scene. There was only speculation and circumstance. He presented the drowning theory as the only explanation that made sense, a plausible, if tragic, alternative to the prosecution's narrative of cold-blooded murder. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, retired to deliberate on July 4th. For less than 11 hours, they weighed 6 weeks of testimony. The nation held its breath. On July 5th, 2011, they returned with their verdict. The court clerk read the charges one by one, her voice cutting through the tense silence. On the count of first-degree murder, not guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Casey Anthony broke into tears, her body shaking as she embraced Jose Baez. On the count of aggravated child abuse, not guilty. On the count of aggravated manslaughter of a child, not guilty. She was found guilty only on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The verdict hit like a thunderclap. A tidal wave of public fury crashed over the courthouse steps. The crowd erupted in outrage that echoed across the entire country. People flooded social media with their disbelief and anger. Legal experts who had confidently predicted a conviction sat stunned, scrambling for explanations. How could this possibly happen? For months, the jurors remained anonymous. When they finally spoke, their reasoning became clear. Yes, the prosecution's case was compelling, but it was built on circumstantial evidence. They had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt exactly how Kaylee died. If you cannot prove what the crime was, one juror later explained, you cannot determine what the punishment should be. They simply could not sentence a woman to death based on a theory. On July 7th, Casey Anthony received 4 years in jail for the misdemeanors. But with credit for time served, she walked free just 10 days later on July 17th, 2011. She slipped out of the Orange County Jail in the dead of night and vanished into hiding. A free woman who remains, in the eyes of much of the world, a guilty one. The central mystery endures, unsolved. How did Kaylee Anthony die? Was it cold, calculated murder by a mother desperate for a beautiful life? Or was it a tragic accident in a backyard pool, followed by a panicked cover-up that spiraled into a web of lies too thick to escape? The jury chose reasonable doubt. The public chose conviction. And somewhere in the space between the two, the truth of what happened to a little girl with brown eyes and a radiant smile lies buried, perhaps forever. Story 10. In the shimmering heat of a Dallas summer where high society flowed like a religion and charm, held more value than oil itself, Sandra Bridewell drifted through the world like a phantom wrapped in grace and elegance. She seemed crafted from the pages of a southern novel, breathtakingly beautiful, with magnificent dark eyes that could capture a man's soul and leave him utterly spellbound in a single glance. Her voice carried the soft, melodic cadence of true femininity. Her manners were nothing short of flawless. To the world watching, she appeared perfect. A loving mother, a devoted wife, a pillar of her community who poured herself into charitable causes and embraced the arts with genuine passion. But beneath that carefully polished surface of Southern belle perfection, something far more sinister lay coiled and waiting. A chilling darkness that followed her like a persistent shadow, leaving behind a wake of broken lives, shattered fortunes, and a haunting trail of bodies that stretched across 3 long decades. This is the story of Sandra Bridewell, the woman they whispered about as the Black Widow, a fatal beauty whose magnetic allure proved as captivating as it was deadly. Her story doesn't begin in the opulent drawing rooms of Highland Park, but rather in the quiet, middle-class landscape of mid-century America. Born in 1944 in Sedalia, Missouri, she was given up as an infant by her birth parents and lovingly adopted by Arthur and Camille Powers. But tragedy struck early and hard. When Sandra was just 3 years old, her adoptive mother died in a devastating car accident. Her father, who managed a Dr. Pepper bottling plant, eventually remarried and moved the family to Oak Cliff, Texas, a Dallas suburb, where he took on work selling cemetery plots. The move brought no peace. Sandra's relationship with her stepmother, Doris, became a battlefield of constant conflict. To friends, Sandra would later paint vivid pictures of a childhood drowning in emotional neglect. She spoke of being locked away in dark closets, of a birthday party where no guests came because her stepmother had supposedly forgotten to mail the invitations. Doris, she claimed, would cruelly tell her she was unwanted, that she had no friends. Whether these stories held truth or represented the first flowering of a lifelong gift for self-serving fiction, they became the foundation of her carefully constructed narrative. She presented herself as a beautiful wounded creature who deserved sympathy and protection. As one friend would later observe, she was a living Cinderella story, always waiting for her prince to rescue her from the ashes of an unhappy youth. She graduated from Kimball High School in 1962, a pretty but largely overlooked girl who somehow didn't even appear in her senior class yearbook. But as she stepped into her early 20s, she began crafting the persona that would define her entire life. Sandra possessed an almost supernatural understanding of what men desired. While her peers buried themselves in movie magazines, Sandra devoured Southern living, absorbing the sophisticated arts of the perfect hostess and mastering recipes like flaming plum pudding. She had developed, as one friend recalled, a ladylike, helplessly sweet routine that men found absolutely irresistible. Her ambition burned like a quiet but ferocious fire. She was utterly determined to marry into money. The glittering life of a Dallas socialite, with its country club lunches, charity balls, and European adventures, represented everything she craved. She pursued that world with laser-focused determination. She cultivated a habit of of reshaping her past, weaving more glamorous backstories for herself. To some, her parents became Irish aristocrats. To others, she claimed degrees from universities where she'd never set foot. She once told an early friend that a beautifully landscaped home in Oak Cliff's wealthy district was where she'd grown up, a lie that crumbled when the friend had to visit her actual, far more modest family home. But Sandra told these fabrications with such conviction, such disarming sweetness, that people, especially men, chose to believe every word. In 1967, her prince finally arrived in the form of Dr. David Stegall, a handsome, ambitious young dentist. Like Sandra, David harbored grand aspirations. He didn't want to be just another suburban dentist. He dreamed of becoming Dallas society's go-to dental specialist, focusing on full-mouth reconstructions for the city's elite. He'd studied in Los Angeles, learning from Hollywood's finest dentists, and he had expensive taste: Cadillacs, grand houses, and beautiful women. Sandra, with her stunning beauty and growing sophistication, seemed like the perfect complement to his soaring ambitions. After a whirlwind 6-week courtship, they were married. They plunged into Dallas's upscale social world with almost desperate enthusiasm. Sandra proved to be a natural master of the game. She threw lavish dinner parties where every single detail sparkled with perfection. She joined the right church, St. Michael and All Angels Episcopal, and became the cookbook chairman. She was creative, perceptive, and utterly enchanting. David, naturally quiet by temperament, found himself guided through the social maze by his wife's expert hand. The strategy paid off handsomely for his practice. His income tripled almost overnight. They moved into an elegant home in the prestigious Greenway Parks neighborhood and immediately launched into expensive renovations. They hired a live-in maid, had their groceries delivered from the city's most exclusive store, and dressed themselves in only the finest clothing. But their reach was stretching far beyond their grasp. They lived like Dallas's old money elite, but the truth was far different. They were drowning in debt. Sandra's hunger for fine art and expensive antiques knew no bounds. She paid a renowned interior designer $35,000, an astronomical sum back then, just to decorate their home. David found himself borrowing heavily from his father, desperately trying to keep their bills afloat. The pressure was crushing. By 1974, their marriage was crumbling. In February 1975, the weight became too much for David Stegall to bear. Sandra claimed she discovered him in a closet, gun pressed to his head, and managed to talk him down. But it was only temporary relief. Just weeks later, on a bitter winter morning, David was found lifeless in their bed. He had wounds to both wrists and a fatal gunshot to the head from a .22 caliber weapon. The Dallas County Medical Examiner ruled it suicide. Sandra was now a widow. If grief consumed her, she masked it perfectly. She swiftly collected the life insurance money, sold David's dental practice, and stepped back into the dating world. She remained stunning, captivating, and now carried the aura of tragedy. A young widow raising 3 small daughters alone. Wealthy, influential men found themselves drawn to her story. Just over 3 years after David's death, she walked down the aisle again. This time with Bobby Bridewell, a beloved Dallas developer who had brought the luxurious mansion on Turtle Creek Hotel to life. Her marriage to Bobby Bridewell marked Sandra's complete arrival into Dallas's most elite circles. Bobby adopted her 3 girls, and they settled into Highland Park, the city's most exclusive and wealthy neighborhood. For a while, it seemed she had finally grasped everything she'd ever wanted. But tragedy, or something resembling it, seemed to shadow her every step. In 1980, just 2 years into their marriage, Bobby received devastating news. Terminal lymph cancer. As her husband battled for his life, Sandra's behavior took a disturbing turn. She threw herself into an extensive home renovation, forcing the sick Bobby to move in with a friend. He would never see their shared home again. 2 years after his diagnosis, in 1982, he was gone. Sandra found herself widowed for the second time. During Bobby's long battle with illness, Sandra had grown remarkably close to his oncologist, Dr. John Bagwell, and his wife, Betsy. Betsy was a warm, caring woman known for reaching out to her husband's patients and their families. After Bobby's passing, Sandra began calling Betsy my new best friend. She seemed to lean on the Bagwells for absolutely everything. But what started as friendship quickly became overwhelming. Sandra became a constant, needy fixture in their lives. She would appear unannounced at their New Mexico vacation home. The phone calls never stopped. The requests for childcare became endless. The Bagwells, exhausted by her suffocating attention, began trying to pull away. After a suspicious incident where Sandra claimed car trouble and lured him from home, only for her car to start perfectly for a responding officer, Dr. Bagwell had enough. He angrily told her to leave them alone and warned his wife to stay away. But Sandra wouldn't be stopped. On a Wednesday in July 1982, just 2 months after Bobby Bridewell's death, Sandra called Betsy. She was distraught, she said, about a letter she'd supposedly discovered. A letter suggesting Bobby had been unfaithful. Betsy, though cautious, found herself pulled back into the drama. Later that same day, Sandra called again. Her car had broken down at a church, and she needed a ride to Love Field Airport to get a rental car. Betsy, who struggled to refuse anyone in need, agreed to help. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, buried beneath Sandra's shifting stories. According to police, Betsy drove Sandra to the airport, but Sandra had forgotten her driver's license and couldn't rent a car. Sandra claimed Betsy then drove her back to the church, where her car, once again, started without any trouble. Sandra said she went shopping after that. At 8:20 that evening, police discovered Betsy Bagwell slumped behind the wheel of her powder blue Mercedes station wagon in Love Field's terminal parking lot. A single bullet wound marked her right temple. A .22 caliber revolver lay in her hand. Despite numerous troubling questions, the Dallas County medical examiner ruled her death a suicide. But to everyone who knew Betsy, the verdict seemed impossible. She was a devoted mother who lived for her family. That very afternoon, she had put meat in the sink to thaw for dinner, telling her children not to snack too much before she returned. Why would she take her own life? And where did that gun come from? It was a stolen Saturday night special, a cheap pistol registered to a dead man from Oak Cliff. How would a Highland Park mother with no experience around firearms end up with a stolen handgun? And why was there no suicide note? The last person known to have seen Betsy alive was Sandra Bridewell. The whispers started then, quiet at first, but persistent. In the gossipy, interconnected world of Highland Park, people began to wonder. As always, Sandra moved on. 2 years later, in June 1984, she was tending to her yard when a handsome 29-year-old man named Alan Rarig happened to drive by. A former college basketball and football star from Oklahoma, Alan had just moved to Dallas to make his fortune in real estate. He pulled his Ford Bronco over and asked if she knew of any apartments for rent. She didn't, but she offered to help him look. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Alan was completely smitten. Sandra, then 44, told him she was 36. She charmed him effortlessly. She introduced him to her children, who began showing up at his office unannounced. Then, in the fall of 1984, she delivered the news that would seal his fate. She was pregnant with his twins. It was a lie of breathtaking audacity. 7 years earlier, Sandra had undergone a hysterectomy, but she had gained some weight. And Alan, deeply in love and with no reason to doubt her, believed the woman who was showering him with affection. In December 1984, feeling the weight of impending fatherhood, Alan Rarig married Sandra Bridewell. The pregnancy, of course, could not last forever. In February 1985, Sandra made a tearful call to her new husband. She had lost the babies. Alan was devastated. The foundation of their marriage, built on a lie, began to crumble. Alan soon discovered what Sandra's previous husbands had learned. She had an insatiable appetite for luxury. She pushed him to make more money, to take out a large life insurance policy. He complained to friends that she spent $20,000 a month. By November 1985, just a year into the marriage, they separated. Alan moved in with a friend, convinced he needed to end the relationship. For several weeks, they didn't see each other. Then, in early December, Sandra called. She asked Alan to meet her at a storage facility where they had put some of their belongings. He agreed. It was the last time anyone who knew him saw him alive. A short time later, Alan Rarig was found slumped over in his Ford Bronco. He wasn't in Dallas. The car was parked near the airport in Oklahoma City. He had been shot multiple times. It was clear his body had been driven there after the attack. The Oklahoma City medical examiner ruled his death a homicide, and the Oklahoma City police had only one suspect: his estranged wife, Sandra Bridewell. Her behavior in the aftermath was a study in cold detachment. When first questioned by police, she was almost playfully evasive before becoming completely uncooperative, refusing to let investigators speak to her or her daughters. She cut corners on Alan's funeral, choosing the cheapest casket available and convincing friends to pay for the burial. She was late to the service, arriving at the last minute dressed to the nines in a spectacular mink coat. She could afford it. Alan's death had put a $220,000 life insurance policy into her bank account. The Rarig murder, combined with the whispers about Betsy Bagwell and David Stiegel, turned the tide of Dallas society against her. In 1987, a magazine published a long, detailed exposé titled The Black Widow.io. Her reputation was destroyed. Less than a year after Alan's death, Sandra Bridewell packed up her children and fled Dallas for good, relocating to the serene, wealthy community of Belvedere in Marin County, California. She had escaped the gossip of Dallas, but she had not escaped herself. She was a woman who lived on charm and deception, and she brought her skills to a new coast. In California, she cycled through a new round of wealthy men, drawing them in with her story of a trust fund she was about to inherit. One man loaned her $23,000. Another gave her over $70,000 from his pension. Neither was ever repaid. But as the stories from Dallas began to follow her, her welcome wore thin. By the early 1990s, she had changed her name to Camille Bridewell and left California. She drifted across the country, from a ritzy apartment in Boston, paid for by a boyfriend, to Connecticut, to Hawaii. Her cons evolved. She began using the social security numbers of other people, including her own children, to take out credit cards and rack up huge debts, destroying their credit in the process. As she aged and her physical beauty began to fade, her methods shifted. She turned from seduction to religion. She reinvented herself as a missionary, a devout woman who traveled the world working with orphans. In Alabama, she befriended the owners of a motel who, despite her inability to pay, gave her food and money. In Atlanta, using the name Bridwell, she convinced a woman from church to split the rent on an expensive condo, then left her new roommate to pay for everything while she supposedly waited for her trust fund to come through. In 2006, now in her early 60s, she surfaced in North Carolina at a new church using the name Camille Bowers. That September, she moved in with Sue Mosley, a 77-year-old widow who lived in a $1 million home on the Carolina coast. She struck a deal with Mosley's son, Jim. In exchange for managing the housework, she would receive free room and board. Before long, she had woven herself into the fabric of the community, singing in the church choir, captivating women's groups with tales of her missionary work in India and China. Churchgoers, moved by her stories of service, showered her with love offerings. But behind this charitable facade, she was methodically dismantling Sue Mosley's life. Tax records disappeared into her hands. Social Security payments found new routes. Mortgage money vanished, funding her spa treatments and designer shoes through Mosley's own bank account. She became the gatekeeper, answering every phone call, intercepting the mail, even delivering Mosley's nighttime medication. But Jim Mosley's suspicions began to grow. This housemate was too controlling, too invasive. Then, in early 2007, fate intervened. A Dallas Observer story appeared on his computer screen, chronicling the twisted tale of a woman named Sandra Bridewell, also known as Camille Powers. The woman staring back at him from that article was living under his mother's roof. Working alongside police, Jim orchestrated a trap. On March 2nd, 2007, Sandra Camille Bridewell, the Black Widow of Highland Park, was finally cornered in a Charlotte, North Carolina cafe. By year's end, federal charges rained down: identity theft, fraud, mail theft. The arrest breathed new life into the cold case, murder of Alan Rarig, and Oklahoma City police dusted off their files. The FBI dove deeper, examining not just the Rarig murder, but every shadow in Sandra's murky past. In February 2008, Sandra Bridewell shuffled into that federal courtroom in North Carolina. At 63, her once raven hair had turned gray. Red prison garb replaced her elegant wardrobe. Handcuffs and shackles marked her fall from grace. In the front row sat Gloria Rarig, Alan's mother. 23 years she had waited for this moment. A large button bearing Alan's photograph adorned her chest. "I just wanted Sandra to see him," she said. The woman who had danced around justice for decades finally surrendered. Instead of fighting, Sandra Bridewell accepted a plea deal admitting guilt to one count of identity theft. That September brought her reckoning: 2 years behind bars and a crushing $250,000 fine. The Mosley family received just over $1,600 in restitution, a pittance that felt more like insult than justice to the families of men who had died in her shadow. She had carved a path of devastation through countless lives, leaving grief and questions in her wake. Yet in the end, she faced conviction not as a killer, but as a common thief. After serving her time, she melted back into America's vastness, vanishing once again. Sandra Bridewell, the fatal beauty who weaponized charm and made tragedy her calling card, walks free today. Her darkest secrets lie buried with the men who loved her. Story 11. The heat in Belle Glade, Florida, has a weight to it. In July, it presses down on the vast flat plains of the Everglades, shimmering over the sugarcane fields and clinging to skin like a second layer of clothing. It's the kind of heat that makes tempers run short and nights stretch endlessly. For Shanti Butts, a 34-year-old mother of 4, the summer of 2025 wasn't just hot, it was suffocating. She lived in a constant state of high alert, with a thrumming anxiety that had become the soundtrack to her days. She was being hunted, and she knew it. The predator wasn't some stranger lurking in the shadows, but a man whose face was as familiar as her own. A man who had once been the center of her world and was now a black hole threatening to swallow it whole. His name was Little M. Williams. Shanti was doing everything she was supposed to do. She followed the rule book for survival that society hands to women in her position. When the man who fathered her children, a man she had once loved, began to unravel into a monster of obsession, she didn't stay silent. She reported him. She filed police reports until the papers stacked up like a grim monument to her fear. She turned her phone into a weapon of defense, documenting his relentless harassment on video. She even fled her own home, seeking refuge from the storm of his rage. She was a fighter, a mother bear protecting her cubs, using every tool at her disposal to build a fortress around her family. But the fortress was made of paper, and the man outside was holding a match. In the final days of her life, her fear became something you could almost touch. It was there in a video she posted to Facebook, her camera trained on Williams as he stood outside her workplace, a brazen act of intimidation. Her voice, trembling but firm, remains a haunting artifact of her final plea for peace. "Please leave. Please leave." she says. The words fall like a desperate incantation against the darkness he represented. I am not okay with this. Please leave my job. I have to go. In that moment, she wasn't just a victim. She was a narrator documenting the story of her own persecution. A story that was hurtling toward a final, violent chapter. The system she was appealing to, the world she was crying out to, was listening. But it wasn't moving fast enough. Just 6 days after law enforcement issued a warrant for his arrest for aggravated stalking, 6 days in which he roamed free while she lived in terror, little Em Williams came for her one last time. The relationship hadn't always been a battlefield. For years, little Em Williams was part of her family. He was a stepfather to her oldest son, who had known him since the age of 6, and the biological father to some of her other children. They had shared a life, a home, but the love, if it had ever been true, had long ago curdled into a toxic brew of control and violence. The final break had come about a month before her death. But for Williams, the end was not an option. If he couldn't have her, no one could. And he was a man with a long and terrifying history of making sure he got what he wanted. His criminal record read like a roadmap of escalating violence against women. A series of red flags that the justice system had acknowledged but never truly heeded. In 2014, he was charged with felony battery, strangulation, and false imprisonment after another ex-girlfriend reported that he had assaulted her. The medical records from that attack documented the physical toll of his rage: swelling, bruising, a hematoma. For that, he pleaded guilty to felony battery and served just 36 days in jail. In 2018, it was another woman, another charge of stalking and trespassing. The conviction netted him 59 days behind bars. In 2023, yet another woman told deputies he had struck her in the head with an unknown object. He pleaded guilty to domestic battery and was sentenced to a mere 2 days in jail. He was a serial abuser, a man who had demonstrated time and again that he was a danger to any woman who tried to leave him. And each time, the system had slapped his wrist and sent him back out into the world, a loaded gun waiting to be aimed at his next target. In 2024, that target became Shanti. In July of that year, a full year before her murder, the violence that had been simmering beneath the surface exploded. He broke into her home and in a fit of rage, choked her and kicked her repeatedly. He was arrested, and this time, the consequences were slightly more significant. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 157 days in jail. A no-contact order was issued, a legal document that was supposed to be a shield for Shanti and a leash for him. But it was a shield made of glass and a leash made of thread. Upon his release, the harassment began almost immediately. He became a ghost who haunted the edges of her life, a constant, menacing presence. He showed up at her home at all hours. He stole her phone, a violation of her privacy and a severing of her connection to the outside world. He damaged her belongings, small acts of destruction that were really messages of power. And then the threats escalated. In an act of chilling premeditation, he stole her firearm from her vehicle. Shortly after, he taunted her with the theft, asking if she was missing her gun. The implication was terrifyingly clear. He was armed now, and the weapon in his hands was hers. In the final 10 days of her life, his campaign of terror reached a fever pitch. On July 2nd, 2025, he broke into her home again. This time, he didn't attack her. He simply walked in and stole a bottle of soda from her refrigerator. It was a bizarre and deeply unsettling act. A clear message that no lock could keep him out, that he could enter her sacred space at will and take whatever he wanted. 2 days later, on the 4th of July, he returned. He chased her to her car, his voice a torrent of threats as she scrambled inside and sped away, fleeing for her life. The very next day, July 5th, was the night the haunting became a siege. Armed with a new sense of security from a Blink doorbell camera she had installed, Shante captured the full, terrifying extent of his obsession. Over the course of a single night, the camera recorded little Mac Williams returning to her home more than 20 times. He would appear at her door, a ghostly figure in the grainy night vision footage, linger, then retreat, only to return again and again. A relentless, nocturnal predator. The footage was a silent scream, a digital record of a mind unhinged. That day, Shante took the footage to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office and filed another report. This time, the evidence was so overwhelming, so undeniable, that deputies issued a warrant for his arrest on a charge of aggravated stalking. For 6 days, that warrant sat in a file. For 6 days, Shante lived with the knowledge that the man who had tormented her, who had stolen her gun, who had promised to hurt her, was a wanted man, but was still free. With every passing hour, her fear grew. A neighbor would later recall a conversation from those final days. Shante had told her that Williams was threatening to kill her. She was scared. The neighbor said she wasn't expecting it. In a final desperate act of self-preservation, she had recently moved into this new home on State Road 75, hoping the new address would finally shake him. But a man like Little Mac Williams is not deterred by a change of scenery. For him, a new address is just a new destination. The night of Friday, July 11th, 2025, was thick with the humid pre-storm air of a Florida summer. Inside the modest house on State Road 75, a new life was trying to take root. Shante was in her bedroom with her new boyfriend, a man who represented a chance at a future free from fear. But the past was not done with her yet. In the home with them were 2 other adults and 6 children, a house full of life and innocence that was about to be shattered. At 11:47 p.m. in another room, Shante's oldest son was lost in the digital world of a video game when a loud smacking noise tore him from his focus. He ran from his room and saw the source of the sound, a broken window. Standing there, having just smashed his way into the home, was Little Mac Williams. The boy's first thought was of the other children. He saw his younger siblings huddled together in fear, and with a presence of mind that belied his age, he instructed them to go into another room and hide. Then he grabbed a phone and dialed 911. The call is a harrowing real-time chronicle of violence. The young boy's panicked voice floods the line as he tells the dispatcher that his stepfather has broken in. The dispatcher, calm and professional, tries to get information, but then a new voice cuts through the chaos. A man's voice, cold and demanding, captured by the open phone line. "It's Williams. Where's your mother?" he barks. The boy doesn't have to answer. A moment later, the sound of gunshots rings out, followed by the boy's horrified cry to the dispatcher. His mother has been shot. In the bedroom, the scene had unfolded with brutal speed. Williams, his face a mask of rage, had burst in. He saw Shante on the bed with her new boyfriend. His words were a venomous acknowledgement of her attempt to move on. "I told you don't bring your boyfriend over here," he snarled at the man. Then he opened fire. He shot the boyfriend in the chest, a single bullet that would wound but not kill. Then he turned his fury on Shante. The son would later tell detectives what he witnessed next. Williams attacking his mother. The struggle that followed, her gasps for air audible over the ringing in his ears. He shot her multiple times, an act of ultimate possession, a final, fatal declaration that if he couldn't have her, no one would. By the time Palm Beach County Sheriff's deputies arrived, the night was split open by the wail of sirens and the flashing of red and blue lights. Down the block from the house, they saw a man matching the description given by the 911 caller. It was Little M. Williams. What happened next was both bizarre and deeply unsettling. As the deputies approached, he lay down on the scorching asphalt without being asked. He spread his arms behind his back, surrendering like an actor performing in a play he had written and rehearsed countless times. The deputies recognized him immediately. His extensive history with law enforcement had made him all too familiar. Inside the house, they discovered a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Shanti Butts lay motionless on her bed, the life drained from her. She was pronounced dead at 11:58 p.m. Her boyfriend, wounded by a gunshot to his chest, was still breathing but in terrible pain. He was rushed to St. Mary's Medical Center, where he would thankfully pull through. In the bedroom, deputies found a black handgun magazine and several shell casings scattered across the floor. The metallic remnants of a life cut short. When they asked Williams about the weapon, he simply shrugged and said he didn't know where it was. But the true horror of that night wasn't just the death of a mother. It was what the deputies found next. 6 children in the home. Their young lives were now forever scarred by trauma no child should ever witness. They had been there through it all. They'd heard the rage, the gunshots, then that final, terrible silence. Their home had become a crime scene, and their mother was gone. A neighbor who'd heard the disturbance had rushed to the house. She later described her chilling encounter with Williams as he was leaving the scene. When she asked him where Shanti was, his response was cold and emotionless, just a simple statement of fact. He said she was dead, she recalled. Under the harsh lights of the interrogation room, little Emma, Williams crafted a story of self-defense and justified anger. He told detectives he had simply walked into what he considered his primary residence through the front door. He claimed an unknown man immediately confronted and attacked him. A man who was armed. During the struggle, he said, the gun just went off. Somehow, he had no explanation for how Shanti, the woman he had just shot multiple times, had been hit. He denied shooting anyone at all. It was a weak, desperate story that crumbled under the weight of evidence and witness testimony. Most damaging of all was the brave young boy who had made that 911 call. Little M. Williams was charged with first-degree murder with a firearm, attempted first-degree murder with a firearm, and being a felon in possession of a firearm. The man who had been a ghost in the justice system, slipping through cracks with lenient sentences and unenforced orders, was finally facing the full consequences of his actions. The story of Shanti Butts is a tragedy in 2 acts. The first act tells of a woman who did everything right. She was a mother who fought with every fiber of her being to protect her children and herself from a man consumed by the need to control her. She used the system exactly as it was designed. She reported. She documented. She pleaded. The second act reveals how that very system failed her at every turn. It failed to recognize the clear and present danger that little M. Williams posed, not just to Shanti, but to any woman who crossed his path. It responded to his escalating violence with sentences that were nothing more than revolving doors, sending him back to the streets with his rage unchecked and his sense of impunity stronger than ever. Her death wasn't a random act of violence. It was the predictable and preventable end to a long-documented history of abuse. It was a murder foretold in every police report she filed, in every desperate plea she captured on video, in every short jail sentence he served. Shanti had screamed for help, and the world heard her, but it didn't answer in time. Her story stands as a heartbreaking reminder that for far too many women, a piece of paper, a no-contact order, is no match for a bullet. This is the story of a mother's love, a monster's obsession, and a system that was tragically, fatally, too.